David narrowed his eyes and spoke in a calm, flat tone, almost like he was talking to himself. Mind tricks like that work on kids. Don't waste them on me. Clap, clap. Two sharp claps echoed, and Nick stepped out from hiding with another student beside him. Behind them, two more figures emerged from the shadows, people David only vaguely recognized. Nick stopped a few meters away, smiling like this was a performance. I honestly thought that would be enough, he said. But you're sharper than I expected. I'm intrigued. David frowned, digging through his memory. Then it clicked. His eyes hardened. Why are you attacking me? They'd clashed a few days ago, sure, but David hadn't taken it seriously enough to remember. Apparently Nick had. Petty. The kind of guy who carried grudges like trophies. Nick opened his mouth, ready to gloat. The lanky youth beside him, Sebastian, tugged his sleeve and whispered something urgently. Nick's expression darkened as he stared at David with forced innocence. You're sinister, Nick snapped. Why would you blame me? We've only just met. David exhaled, almost disappointed. So Sebastian caught the trap. If Nick admitted to attacking another student without starting a forced duel or mutual duel, the Institute would hammer him for breaking rules. David's question had been bait, and Nick nearly swallowed it whole. David's eyes shifted to Sebastian. The other two were background noise. Nick was loud but sloppy. But Sebastian felt different. David couldn't explain it, but his instincts tagged him as the real threat. He didn't want this fight. He had better things to do, like sleep. Well, David said, turning away, if that's all, I'll be going. Nick's voice snapped like a whip. Smash it. Now. David looked back just in time to see a familiar blue cube streak toward the floor, spinning in a blur. An EMP cube. No warning. David's legs bulged, muscles swelling in a split second. He stomped hard. Bang! His body shot forward like a cannon round. He reached out, aiming to catch the cube before it hit. He wasn't stupid. Last time he took a loss because he didn't know how to handle this thing. Now he did. He'd just come from the library. He knew a dozen counters, but most required gyno points to buy the right contraptions. The only free method was simple. Catch it before it breaks. His fingers were an inch away when every hair on his body screamed. David withdrew instantly, but not before he flicked the cube upward with his middle finger, popping it a few inches into the air. A blade-like foot cut through the space his hand had just occupied. Too close. The tip of his middle finger stung, nails sliced clean with surgical precision. All of it happened in about a second. David's eyes cooled. Sebastian. The lanky one had struck first, fast and clean, like he'd predicted David's move. And worse, it was the kind of move the Institute's AI could excuse. Because technically, Sebastian had aimed at the cube. His technique accidentally intersected with David's hand. If the main AI ran the calculations, it would likely conclude David got in the way. You couldn't lie to the AI, but you could manipulate the story it saw. That foot technique wasn't normal either. Sword foot, a razor-sharp strike that could slice through flesh and bone like paper. At higher mastery, it became sword shadows, producing multiple cutting afterimages to tear through multiple targets. Sebastian chose it for one reason. It was lethal, and it was fast. If David hadn't pulled back when he did, 2 fingers would have been gone. David stepped back, expression serious, ignoring the cube as it hit the ground and shattered. He didn't care about the arcs of electricity crackling outward as the EMP activated. His eyes stayed locked on Sebastian. And who are you supposed to be? David asked quietly. Sebastian's gaze sharpened too. His strike had been clean, the timing perfect. He had expected severed fingers at minimum. But David was faster. Before Sebastian could answer, Nick barked out a laugh. You're done for. I'll teach you what happens when you mess with me. He pointed at David like a commander. What are you waiting for? Attack him. David didn't speak. His eyes swept across the 4 of them as they started to spread out, trying to box him in. 4 against 1. Even weak opponents became dangerous when they surrounded you. But David's focus stayed on the lanky youth. Nick was noise. The other 2 were muscle. Sebastian was the knife. David stared at Nick. You don't want to do this. Nick sneered. Oh, you scared now. Then Nick shouted again, loud enough to ruin his own plan. Hurry up. The EMP's got like 20 seconds left. Beat him fast and get out. Sebastian almost stumbled, expression flickering. Idiot. Now David knew the exact play. Stall until the EMP ended. Regain access to his tools. Turn the fight. David didn't even react. He already knew low-grade EMPs only lasted under a minute anyway. His muscles quivered, then expanded. His feet hit the ground with a heavy thud, and he vanished. The metal concrete floor dented under the force of his launch. To the others, he was just a blur. One moment David stood in the center. The next, he was right in front of one of them. Heat surged with his heartbeat as he threw a punch. Fast. Too fast. The student's eyes widened as he tried to retreat and circulate his combat technique, but he needed a full second to build the flow. A second was a lifetime. All he managed was to cross his arms. David's punch landed like a hammer wrapped in fire. Bang! Air burst. Wind spiraled. The student flew backward, lifted off the ground like he'd been hit by a moving truck. David didn't even look to see where he landed. He turned. A spinning kick screamed toward his head. Sebastian. He was already in motion, rotating midair, releasing 3 sword foot strikes in succession. The air screeched under the cutting force. David's eyes flickered. He raised both hands and chopped downward again and again, meeting the razor edge head-on. Clang, clang, clang. It sounded like metal colliding. The impact made David's body tremble for a heartbeat. Then he stabilized instantly, feet biting into the floor, gaze cold and steady. Now it wasn't a brawl anymore. It was a real fight. David pulled his hands back. A few drops of blood rolled down his palms, but he didn't even blink. His body had been strengthened recently. Once his muscles hardened, they were almost like steel. Cuts were nothing. What bothered him was the force that came with Sebastian's strike. It wasn't just sharp, it was invasive. That razor energy slipped past surface defense and tried to chew through flesh from the inside, hunting for blood vessels and tendons like it wanted to cripple his hands permanently. David's eyes narrowed, but he also knew he wasn't truly in danger. His muscles trembled once, not from fear, from control. A strange oscillation spread through his body, forming a unique vibration force. Sebastian's sword foot carried a piercing, cutting intent. David's vibration carried only one intent: destruction. The moment the two forces met, the sharp energy was shattered, erased like a needle hitting a grinder. David dispelled the oscillation immediately after. His body still couldn't sustain that output for long. He'd used the same method before, back when Janine's shockwave force had entered his body. It was the only reason he hadn't been torn apart from the inside that day. Some red-grade techniques weren't one skill. They were built from multiple lower grades, stacked and refined until they became something else entirely. David's red-grade technique, already touching the early stage of its second state, was formed from 3 brown-grade techniques fused into one. That alone showed the gap. It was called threefold steps. Originally, David broke it into 3 parts and trained each part separately to speed up improvement. First aspect, a heart constriction trick that made the opponent's heart skip for a beat. Useless in most people's eyes. Nobody sane would waste points learning it. Second aspect, forcing blood into specific vessels while vibrating muscles at a precise frequency, generating an explosive force meant to destroy everything in its path. If your physique wasn't strong enough, that same force would rampage through your own body like a wild beast, shredding veins and muscles. Third aspect, using a tremor through the foot to redirect that explosive force and propel the body forward, turning the body itself into a launch mechanism. The theory behind it was complex enough that explaining it to most people would just confuse them. Compared to that, Sebastian was still using a high-tier black-grade technique. In terms of force, it was like comparing a child's punch to a grown man's hammer. Sebastian retreated sharply to avoid David's grab. His legs throbbed from the earlier clash. It felt like he'd kicked an iron rod. David closed in. Then his hand flicked. Smooth. Clean. His strike changed direction mid-motion and went straight for Strevor instead. Sebastian's eyes widened. A feint. He'd been played. His face darkened, but he didn't panic. He stayed cold, calm, and ready. Nick, on the other hand, stared like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. One subordinate had already been sent flying. Then David caught sword foot barehanded. A bad feeling crawled into Nick's stomach. Did I kick an iron wall? But when Nick saw David target Strever, something clicked in his head and a slow, sinister smile crept onto his face. Courting death. He leaned forward, eager. David stepped in and threw a punch like a crashing wave. Swish! Pa! His fist was knocked aside. David's eyes widened slightly. Strever was huge, packed with muscle, and he used a boxing technique to deflect the strike. His body swayed, but he recovered almost instantly. He ate most of that and stayed standing. David admitted, surprised. With repeated training in his unique exercise method, David's strength had risen far beyond normal. He could tell when someone was actually tough. From the faint blood flow rhythm in Strever's body, David could tell he hadn't even hit the 60-cycle threshold. And yet he still held firm. That moment of surprise gave Strever time to stabilize. David didn't plan to let it happen again. He surged forward, fists raining down like a storm. Strever blocked the third punch. The fourth drove him backward, face paling under the impact. He roared, anger and humiliation boiling over. His frame swelled. His palm expanded, thickening grotesquely, like muscle had been pumped with air. He hadn't wanted to use it this early, but he had no choice. Rupturing palm, a palm strike slammed toward David with crushing pressure. The air detonated. Even gravity seemed to thicken, pressing down as the outstretched hand came in with terrifying speed. David's face twitched. Even an ant struggles at the edge of death. He didn't dodge. He never planned to. His blood boiled. Pressure warped the air around his fist as he struck back, this time with everything he had. Nick's grin widened. This was what he'd been waiting for. A technique in its third state. He'd never witnessed one up close. As boss, he always had to act cool, but inside he was starving for this sight. He didn't even consider the possibility that David had a technique nearing the second state. People who reached even the first stage were rare. Second state? Almost unheard of. Nick watched, hungry for David's misery. Bang, bam, bam, bam. One figure held a striking stance, slowly withdrawing his hands. The other staggered back 3 steps, leaving deep imprints in the reinforced floor. Blood rushed violently, forced the wrong way by the collision. His face flushed red, and he coughed up a mouthful of blood. His circulation was disrupted. For a moment, he couldn't push blood properly at all. He needed time, but would his opponent give it? The answer came instantly. With a sharp impact, that figure was knocked out cold. And when the dust cleared, it was Strever lying there. Nick's face twisted. "You!" Fury exploded out of him as he charged. "Die!" Bang! Nick went flying too, out cold before he even knew what hit him. Now only 2 remained inside the EMP field. David and Sebastien. Sebastien's dark face split into a smile as he cracked his neck. Pa pa pa. Bones popped like dry branches. "That idiot finally shut up," he said, almost satisfied. Then he stared at David like a man who enjoyed pain for sport. "I should thank you for that. Tell me, should I break one of your limbs? Or both?" He tilted his head, pretending to think. David didn't answer. There were only 7 seconds left anyway. He was already starting to miss his bed. Sebastien smiled wider. I've decided. I'll break all 4. The moment he finished speaking, his body vanished. What David had been looking at was an afterimage. Shadow splicing. A gadget-based technique that manipulated shadow and low-spectrum visibility, warping perception and masking movement. Expensive. Not something a normal student should casually own. David frowned. As expected, Sebastien was the real headache. With the gadget active, David couldn't fully track him. He had to rely on instinct, muscle memory, and the warning signals in his skin. He twisted his neck. A pointed foot stabbed toward the back of his head. Bam! David blocked the second sword foot with his hands. Blood sprayed. In that same heartbeat. Bam! Third strike. Bam! Fourth. Bam! Fifth. So he'd been hiding his real level from the start. The two collided in a blur of cutting force and brutal counters. One mistake would mean broken bones, or worse. It felt like a long exchange. It wasn't. 3 seconds.
Hey everyone, Firescale Audiobooks here. If there's a novel you'd love to hear more of, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Depending on your tier, I'll make extra parts just for the stories you're most excited about. Usually I can only upload 4 to 5 parts of each novel, but with your support, we can go beyond that. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps more than you know.
For a new student, acquiring a gadget was an impossibility. Even if it was only a low-level gadget, as they cost an enormous amount of gyno points in order to redeem them from the Institute. It was still unbelievable. A few days back, Nick had used his own means to connect to the black market and its people, which was very remarkable as a new student and shows how well connected he is, considering how secretive the black market was. Settling up a meeting with one of its members, he had then sent Sebastien his place to go purchase the cubic EMP, as he didn't dare to go himself. The dangers involved were something he could deal with also. He couldn't afford to get caught, so he sent Sebastien in his place instead. But who would have known that not only did Sebastien not purchase the EMP, he had made good friends with the person he had met, which eventually lead him into getting a gadget for himself at an incredibly cheap price. Shadow Splicer, a low-level gadget of the Light Maniputor series. It basically had the ability to obscure one's presence by manipulating the light and shadows in the surrounding area with the use of radiation. It was a decent gadget to own. It was in a form of a flat, transparent tablet with crystal clear body. But its only downside was that it would only work on low-level spryhers with blood revolutions lower than 60 cycles per second. Although it was decent, its functionality is very limited, as it would be of no use in a few weeks, as the other students would probably be string enough to ignore its effects. Repeatedly using his palms to block the unlimited amount of kicks headed his way, his hands was already bloody as the Meg had been dyed red by his own blood. The blue barrier began to flicker softly. Oomph. David suddenly didn't bother to dodge anymore. He was only keeping up with this nonsense because he wanted to see he was going to far once he was put into a more severe situation than this. He could hold on a little longer, but his hands were already sore and tired. He wasn't a person who enjoyed pain, and once the pain was getting obvious, he instantly threw TE Plan to the back of his head, circulating his blood to its limit. The feeling his brainwaves transmitted suddenly changed as an imposing aura covered the surroundings. Feeling this change, Sebastien hurriedly withdrew. Ezra didn't know what had happened. He was clearly suppressing David, toying with him, but this situation suddenly popped up. What is happening? He suddenly heard David say, "Let this last move decide everything." Sebastien was an extremely smart person. All his years, he didn't waste them in foolishness. Although he didn't know what just happened, he wasn't foolish enough to remain idle. Before David's voice could fade, he immediately circulated his blood to its limit. His body turned red slightly due to its fast pace as his muscles shook like a stormy wave. Must rise from his head as the sweat that had accumulated in his body began to evaporate due to the friction in his vein. His figure suddenly rose a few meters into the air. Swish! His body quickly started rotating like a spinning top, and a sharp aura pierced into the sky. He suddenly landed onto David like a turbojet plane. Tins of swordfoot instantly swished down towards David's head, without warning, attempting to toggle his body with holes, turning his head into an hornet's nest. It was Sebastien's ultimate technique, a mixture of two mid-tier black-grade technique. But its might was almost comparable to a high-tier black-grade technique practiced to perfection. A lightweight technique which reduces one's weight by freely changing one's center of gravity for a few seconds, and a kicking technique which gets better the more weightless one could become. With that, he could dish out as many sword foot as fast as he can, but the strain of circulating two techniques was too much, and the amount of concentration needed to do so was exhausting. If only one had the ability to double task, it might be slightly less difficult. He had come up with it just recently, as he had paid a little amount of gyno points to stumble on such information in the archives before he went to meet the member of the black market. He wasn't so stupid to go without protecting himself, and he was pretty sure that not just anyone could take his ultimate technique without being severely injured. The attack was piercingly fast as the shadows of kicks filled the air. One might think the shadows were after images, but they were all real attacks. Sebastian's attack was just too fast after he defied gravity for that single second. David's eyes lit up, and he changed his stance in an instant. Entering threefold steps with a single stride, his foot stomped the ground as he suddenly halted with a screech. Boom! David's feet landed on the hard floor, and the ground, which was made with a special material in the street, instantly burst apart, creating a deep ravine a few inches deep and a few inches wide. Dust clouds flew into the air that had sentience, and the entire ground trembled. With a single threefold step, David's aura intensified as though he was about to break apart the earth. Not good. Sebastian's pupils constricted in fear, and he almost lost his balance in the air. He quickly changed his position, and then like a swallow, he switched moves in an instant. Pa! Pa! David's muscles intensified as the veins in his body quivered incessantly like an anaconda. His tendons crackled in sheer might. A forward lean, and a stomp. Threefold stomp. Bang! The air shook as the wind swirled angrily, and Sebastian's figure shook slightly, and they passed by each other closely. Sebastian had actually managed to dodge the attack. He didn't wait to marvel at the skill of his escape technique. He dashed forward rapidly, attempting to leave the range of the EMP. David might have severely injured himself, or at the very least, his blood circulation might be disrupted because he had to forcefully pull his technique since it met no feedback. But with his terrifying control he had over his body, it was a piece of cake. If it were another person, they might have used the opportunity to attack David while his blood revolutions were being disrupted, but Sebastian proved he was quite the cautious type. He took off instead with his fastest speed, attempting to dash out of the EMP's range. He didn't know what else David had up his sleeves, so it was better to just retreat. And, as expected, he was actually right. Trying to flee, David snorted coldly as anger surged in his eyes. With the quiver of his body, David's feet sank into the sturdy floor as his figure disappeared. Fourfold steps. Boom! The ground trembled as his feet exploded by 4 times its previous size. Terrifying veins revealed itself like little snakes. He finally revealed his true strength. He covered 10 meters in a single stride and caught up with Sebastian in a few steps, throwing a fist at his back. Heat waves erupted from his fist, distorting the surrounding with its explosive might. Scorching fury, a fist with an explosive effect. Bang! Sebastian shrieked as his was sent flying like a cannonball to the direction he was fleeing to. He coughed out mouthfuls of blood as he stared at David in disbelief. He hadn't expected that even when he executed his ultimate technique, he would still be beaten and that David had only shown his true might. His speed was simply too fast. Then he collapsed to the floor. He was already unconscious from the pain. His back had been scorched. Black as a faint black imprint if a dust could be seen on his back. The smell of cooked meat roused the atmosphere. It smelled good, yet that thought was nauseating. David calmed down. His brainwaves instantly receded back from their intense activity, and his aura soon faded. In a flash, he disappeared from original position. In the next second, the blue barrier flickered unstably, and then with a bang, it exploded finally, revealing 4 unconscious students lying down on the mangled floor. By then, David was long gone. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Franklin shouted in anger. His AI notified him of a new task he had been assigned to. Franklin desperately needed the littlest amount of gyno points he could get in order to forward his experiments. He had failed miserably in creating his own basic gene fluid, which would help him becoming an apprentice geneticist, finally becoming a member of the Generic Association. But he had been failing, and now he was almost close to successfully creating the night vision gene fluid when his momentum was suddenly disturbed by the AI. Although the AI informed him as silently as it could, but his momentum was already disrupted, there was nothing he could do regarding that. Ah! He shouted furiously and angrily threw a glass tube to the wall in anger, but in a split second, he caught up to it in a flash as he held into it carefully, like one would to a baby. He panted hard as he thought of the situation he would be placed once he broke it. Right now, he was in one of the facilities of the Institute used for various experiments. He had rented a room, and it was cheap. The only downside to it was the rule. Break 1 by 3. The warning had been written in capital letters. Every word was strong and forceful. No one would ever dare to ignore. It was in every single doors in the facility. No matter how expensive the equipment broken was, one would have to buy 3 of it. As a miser, he wasn't resigned to submit himself to such obvious robbery. He was in his 2nd year now in the Institute, and he still wasn't successful. The Institute would soon send him off to the front lines once they saw that his potential was wasted. They had only kept him because he had shown talents in the field as a geneticist. That was why he wasn't sent to the front lines yet. After opening up his holographic image, he skimmed through his messages. Franklin read over the task with the fastest speed possible before hurriedly accepting it. It was a fact that he wasn't the only one who had received the task request. There are thousands of students in the Institute that are in desperate need for gyno points in order to advance in their researches or to purchase the resources needed to advance in strength. For example, the gene fluid Franklin was creating a while back, night vision gene fluid. Upon ingesting the gene fluid, the genetic arrangements and the DNA helix, which made up the entire structure of the human eye, would evolve as the genetic codes would be changed into a different structure. Eventually, the eyes would gradually possess the ability to see during the nighttime. As it was only a basic gene fluid, the effect was minimal. And takes a lot of time to reconstruct, re-edit, and imprint the night vision gene onto the existing gene. Also, the night vision vial only had a range of tens of meters, which allows one to only roughly see through the dark. That IT was a very complicated process. The night vision gene fluids cost an enormous amount of gyno points to purchase directly from the Institute. The advantages is that it can be upgraded by an even higher level of gene fluid, as the genetic codes that made up the eye structure would be forcefully overwritten. It was only cheaper to buy the materials needed for the preparation of the specified gene fluid from the Institute. Otherwise, one could only purchase the cloud directly. Exiting the lab facility, Franklin didn't waste a single seconds as he activated his Skywalker. He jumped a few meters in the air and activated his Skywalker immediately. Soft waves of energy combusted fiercely as waves flickered through the superscript 1. Email protected. His figure floated a few meters into the air with the gentle thrusters of mini-engine placed underneath them. He turned toward a certain sun before he headed towards there in haste as he moved his legs as though he was running in the air, while he moved both his legs with speed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Upon reaching his destination, he immediately frowned with what he saw, and he knew that things are about to get pretty serious. He saw 4 students lying prone to the ground unconscious. As he was about to step forward to begin his task, when he suddenly heard a sound. Whoosh! A figure dived down from above as it descended slowly. The thrusters of the boot surged with energy as the gravitational field was countered. At first, Franklin didn't see who it was since the figure was watering a cloak, but as the figure closed in, descending to the ground, deactivating its thrusters, the figure landed with a slight thud. Franklin's face instantly darkened, but in a split second, his expression turned normal. "You are here," Franklin said as he moved close to one of the boys, currently unconscious, checking in his injuries. Upon hearing this, the figure released the hood that was hiding their face. The clock instantly revealed a very beautiful lady with great curves. Her eyes shone with a gray light as sharpness flickered imperceptibly. Kira wasn't even bothered about answering him. Instead, she asked with another question of hers, "What happened here?" Not minding about the fact that he had been ignored, Franklin leaned forwards as he observed the surrounding scenario where the fight had taken place. "Don't ask me, because I also just got here." After his diagnosis, he then spoke up. "They all seem to be unconscious with only a few bones broken, just a minor injury, nothing major." He then stood up from his previous bent position. Although Franklin wasn't qualified yet as an apprentice geneticist, his year of experience didn't fail him as he fully diagnosed the situation. But although he was good at observing injuries, he wasn't really good in observing the battlefield. That was the reason why Doing Institute and sent Kira to assist him observe the battery field for evidence and traces which could lead to the culprits involved in the forbidden fight. As it was illegal to start a fight in the Institute without initiating a forced duel first, nor a mutual duel, Kira checked the surroundings, and she scrutinized her eyes. A piercing gray light seemed to emerge from her eyes as the surroundings seemed to shine. It seemed as though she has activated some kind of technique to find out the traces and details involved in the surrounding of the previous fight. Then she spotted the deep ravine David had forcefully made with his leg, and a series of deep footprint deep in the ground. Franklin's voice sounded out. It should be group conflict, and judging by the fact that there was no recordings made, nor was there any distress message sent to the main AI, it's clear they had some kind of EMP activated. Only a group could afford such cost at the very of activating an EMP. Franklin thought thoroughly through the situation, and that was the best conclusion you could come up with. Kira kept quiet for a while, but her eyes continued to observe the battlefield. Then suddenly, she shook her head, clearly stating that he had the whole situation wrong. From what I could observe, I think it is only one person. They're not this 4 students unconscious. Franklin frowned slightly as he thought he had heard wrongly. Kira nodded her head in confirmation as she repeated that. I think no, I am pretty sure that it is the same person. They soon left to report their findings, along with various evidence. And the unconscious students too. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A few weeks after his fight with Nick and his subordinates, David didn't let it affect him anyways, while he practiced in Delhi gently every day, not wasting his days. The second week could be said to be quite hectic for him. As it was written in the student guide, every protected force duels would be renewed every week. When one had been initiated a force duel, the participant would be forced to fight in a duel, regardless of his opinion. Regardless of who won, the one who had initiated the force's duel would not be able to cast any free force duel cards for a week, while the one who had been forced to a duel will have his or her profile protected by the AI for a week. In past 2 weeks, David had dealt with various situations and unexpected attacks from various people he didn't even know or had ever met. Someone had even bought a one-time contraption that targets protected profiles in order for the profile to accept the forced battle one more time, just to deal with him. During that time, David had been quite relaxed and had left down his guards by a few notches when suddenly he had been forced into another duel. It came as a surprise to him, which had caused him quite a bit of pain as his opponent didn't let in on the opportunity to attack him fast. If not for his quick wits and his ability and the fact that he had grown stronger every single day, he might just be lying in a hospital bay right now. David had just walked out of from the large hall with Nihia in tow. It was also the last lecture they had for the day. Otherwise, they are free for the remainder of the day. As the duo said their goodbyes and parted ways, David didn't immediately head to his dorm directly. Instead, he headed straight towards the archives. The reason for that was because a few days ago, while he was practicing his training manual, David had suddenly realized that the efficiency of the manual had reduced by quite a lot, to the extent that there was little to no effect the last time he had practiced his training manual. On a normal circumstances, according to his calculations, the efficiency of the training method would only cease after a few years of repeated practice, which had come to quite a shock to him when he realized that his heart rate and blood revolutions had failed to increase by even a single beat or a single cycle. It was as if there was something in his chest forcibly suppressed his blood revolution, refusing to budge in the slightest bit. David reached the archives, and he entered into the building. The rows of bookcases were still empty, and when David looked towards the counter, he saw the young lady who had threatened him and Nihia the first time they had arrived at the archives. And this time, she was also busy reading a few books whose title was obscured from his vision. Taking large steps, he walked towards the young lady, and when he arrived in front of her, he loudly rapped his fingers gently on the iron counter to gain her attention. As for the warning she had given to him the previous time, he didn't really take it to heart. Since students weren't allowed to fight carelessly, he wasn't worried at all, although his tap was soft and gentle. The archive was a very silent place to begin with, such that even the sound of a pin dropping would be loud. So David's tap was specifically a little more louder. Although the archives had been altered to block sound, the librarian's seat was exempted from such altercations. Obviously, startled, the young lady quickly did away with the books she was holding. Still with her head down, she quickly adjusted herself, and with the brightest smile she could possibly muster, she raised up and greeted David. "Good morning, sir. How can I help?" Her voice was suddenly cut off, and suddenly her smile dropped as she noticed the person standing in front of her desk. With a frown and in an indifferent tone, she spoke up, "And what is it that you want?" Opening up the holographic image, she went back to what she was previously doing, ignoring David once more. She honestly thought it was another inspection that was made by the supervising department. It had been a month since she had seen them, so she was a bit jumpy at this crucial moment. If they saw that she was reading the book that the students was supposed to pay to read, it might not cause any problems because the benefits of working as a receptionist includes reading books for free, but she tends to ignore her surroundings when she reads. She usually becomes immersed in her readings, and when disturbed, she tends to have a violent temper, as her mouth would do the talking before her brain responds. This had happened to him the previous time he had come here, so David wasn't the slightest bit surprised by this development. With a smirk on his lips, as he replied in a deep voice, "Are you sure you want to ignore me this time?" It was as though he was threatening her. She suddenly stood up, and eyes suddenly lit up in flames of anger. "Sure? Sure. Yes, I'm sure I want to ignore you," she babbled her response. And when she noticed David as keeping silent, she smiled satisfactorily and went back to her books. She didn't have time for his nonsense. But then, she suddenly heard David say, "All right, but who are those guys watching us at my 7-foot o'clock?" She subconsciously raised her head to check, while simultaneously responding, "Why would I care who they are?" Her words were then stuck in her throat as her eyes widened, and as if she hadn't looked towards there the first instance. She acted quite casual, flipping down her imprint as she stood up with her back straight. She then smiled with her lips curled up. She was very beautiful as she smiled with her curves quite visible through the robes she was wearing. It appears that the glasses she was wearing and the big brown robes she always donned on obscured her beauty and her curves. She smiled as she spoke sweetly. "How long were they there for?" David took his time as he folded his arms, with a sinister smile on his face. Frida squinted her eyes, and she gritted her teeth about to let out another stream of words. The corner of her eye caught into the people behind them, obviously spying at them. Her attitude changed, but through gritted teeth, she spoke up. "All right, what do you want?" she stated. "Now, that's more like it." David smiled widely. It was an obvious blackmail. It would take quite a lot of time if he decides to start searching through all the books in the archives for the problems he was currently facing, but if he has someone who could help him through it, why not? His demeanor then turned serious as he asked the topics concerning problems of Spryer faces and the solution on how to overcome them. "I need those books for a good buddy of mine. He didn't have time to come here, so I thought I should help out." The young lady stood still, as though she was frozen, and then, without warning, she burst out with laughter while holding her stomach in the desk. David stood there blankly. He didn't know what to do. How did this situation turn out this way? Why was she even laughing? She is obviously not faking it this time. He was dumbfounded for a while, and her laughter didn't seem to fade for a while. Wiping up her tears, she giggled softly as she said, "Sorry about that. So what particular problem is this friend of yours facing?" Placing emphasis on the word friend, she then held her mouth as if to stifle her laughter. If David didn't know the reason for her laughter by now, he should just go hit his head on a rock. With an expressionless face, "You saw through the lie, didn't you?" he confirmed. But this made her burst out into laughter once again. When she calmed down, it was very obvious. "Couldn't you come up with something better than that? That was a very stupid idea." She giggled cutely, and her deep dimples made its appearances once again. She was a very beautiful young lady with a very long black hair, deep black eyes that shone like the very crystals they are, long black eyebrows that almost looked fake, Her perfectly symmetric lips and nose that seemed to be in faultless work of art made David a bit stunned. Clearing his throat, he sighed. That was what I could come up with, okay. All right, you've had your fun. Now can you point me to the right direction? I'm in a bit of a hurry right now, he stated plainly. Being made fun of by a pretty girl would obviously spoil any guy's mood and make them embarrassed. Chuckling softly, it being quite a while in had such a good laugh, so I might as well just reward you. Tell me what your problem is. I might be of help to you. Frida said. David hesitated. It wasn't quite sure if I should tell her the problem is currently facing with his practice. I'm not really sure if I should tell you. And also, how do I know you can't help me? Frida rolled her eyes as she said, I've been in the Institute for about 3 years now, so I'm pretty sure I have experienced more problems than you're currently facing. And if I guess correctly, you're a new student at the Institute, so I'm quite confident in answering your questions correctly. Puffing up her bountiful chest. Also, I have a license as a consultant, and you should know, new students pay me quite a good amount of gyno point just for a little piece of advice from me, she stated Bradley proudly. David stared at her intensely. He wasn't sure if could trust her, as she doesn't seem to be responsible, but he decided to give a try. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A few meters away from where David and Frida were speaking, 5 people could be seen seated in a corner, talking with each other while at the same time glancing toward a certain direction. 3 young men, a middle-aged man that seemed to be a professor, and a pretty lady. The middle-aged man, called Greenstone, suddenly spoke up. Previously, you confidently stated that Frida doesn't deserve to be a receptionist, as she frequently ignored those who came to her for help, and you would show me evidence regarding that. But, Greenstone said with a furrowed brows as he glanced at the still, smiling Frida. After a while, he continued, but from what I see and from the way she's interacting with the young man over there, she seems to be a pretty good receptionist. I don't see any problem with that. He then stared menacingly at the young lady and her group. Did you come here just to waste my time? I don't have enough time for myself, but you came here to waste my time for this nonsense. Do you know your crime? Or did you think I came here because of that meager little amount of gyno points you sent me? This bastard, how is 50,000 gyno points a meager sum of money? The young lady cursed in her mind, but she hurriedly stood up as she respectfully said, Professor Greenstone, I promise that is not it. It wasn't my intention to bring you here for nothing. I don't understand what was happening either, but from what I can come up with, I think she spotted us already and is faking that smile. She stared hatefully at Frida. She had also applied for the position as a receptionist at the archives along with Frida and all beautiful female students, but Frida had been chosen because she was the most beautiful and respectful, and also with humble background the group of girls who had applied as a receptionist that wasn't all. Because of her deep, beautiful dimples that seemed to make an impression on anyone, she had been chosen. At least, that was what Brenda thought. Brenda was incredibly jealous of Frida. She had been desperately chasing after the position as a receptionist for a few years. Preparing herself for every moment, she fulfilled every requirement it might have taken as she really needed the position. And according to her calculations, she had the most chances at attaining the job amongst other applicants. She just had to be patient, and the job would gently land on her laps. But everything turned to shit when she didn't know exactly what had happened, but suddenly, someone else had been chosen in her stead. She couldn't quite believe it. The position was already in her laps. All that remained was for her to grab them, but someone else had done that instead. She was incredibly incensed to the extent that she filed numerous reports, but all that was for naught. The job was incredibly important to her. It wasn't about the gyno points. With a slight movement of her skills, Second could acquire as much gyno point as she wanted. It wasn't much of a problem to her. She didn't give up. As an employee in the archives, she could read any books she wanted except from the training method and combat techniques. Those were forbidden to be read by the receptionist, but apart from that, everything in the archives is free for the receptionist to read as she or he deemed fit. No matter the amount of gyno points one might have, it was impossible to freely read some materials as they required a specific amount of authority to access them. There are different levels to authorities which allows access to a limited amount of resources and materials. And it is practically impossible to increase one's authority levels with gyno points. The AI records each contribution made to the institute, and then increases the experience bar accordingly. A new student in the institute is automatically granted a level 1 authority. But as their contribution or talents to the institute begins to grow, their experience point, which is being installed into their imprint, will also begin to grow, and after some time, the tag may be promoted to the next level, which is a level 2 tag. New students are usually ignorant about the authority level system since it was almost useless to them during the first year of being in the institute. Only a few new student LS are aware of the fact. Meanwhile, a professor in the institute is directly granted a level 2 authority tag as soon as they begin working, and as their contribution to the institute begins to accumulate, the experience points system installed in their AI will also begin to grow until it breaks past the bottleneck of the level 2 authority and then promoted into owning a level 3 authority. For example, Professor Mu originally owned a level 2 tag, but as his contribution to the institute continues to grow, he was gradually promoted, and very recently, he owned a level 4 authority imprint, which he had utilized almost immediately. But Professor wasn't as his Prof Mu. Even after a few years, he was still stuck with a level 2 authority tag, unable to break past the final limit. It wasn't that he hadn't tried hard enough. He'd done his very best, but the fact that he was just a mediocre person who had gotten his position through treachery remained. He was not as talented as Professor Mu nor other professors in the institute. I don't understand what was happening either, but from what I can come up with, I think she spotted us already and is faking that smile. Brenda said as she turned to stare hatefully at the still, smiling Frida, how she hates those deep holes on her cheek. Brenda could easily get hers, but that would be very obvious, and the fact that she wasn't born with it might make people disdain her. As soon as he heard those words, his face darkened. Nonsense. Professor Greenstone chortled. I specifically chose this spot due to the fact that it was an obvious blind spot. Haven't you heard of the phrase, the best place to remain hidden is to remain seen in plain view? Brenda's incredibly beautiful face turned red. She was angry this time. She could deduce that the professor wasn't willing to help her. What hidden in plain view? What evidence? If he really had the authority and wanted to help her, all he needed was a few words and his testimony, even if it was made up. The institute obviously won't choose a student over a professor. Now that she thought about it, she suddenly realized that she hadn't verified his original authority level in the first place. She had thought he was a level 3 authority owner, but from his situation, she can finally guess that Professor Greenstone was still just a level 2 authority owner. The same authority level as her. He had been lying to her and everybody all this while although people were doubting she hadn't thought a professor would lie about that. She gradually calmed down as the respectful gaze she had used to look at him previously disappeared, and it appeared quite disdainful. This is an obvious waste of my time. Do not let me see you next time, young lady. He swung his sleeves as he turned around to leave. Brenda didn't say any more. She watched in as the instructor left. She had been scammed, and she knew it. Although she said she could get as much gyno point as she wanted, but 50,000 gyno point was no small amount. It was an incredibly large amount of money. No one could just let that go, and with her character, she has been scammed of 50,000 gyno point. She obviously couldn't let it go. She would collect the money from him with interest. Her lips suddenly curled upward as she had already thought of a plan. Suddenly, she was interrupted by a sudden bout of laughter. If it weren't for the fact that the archives had been installed with noise reduction gadget, everyone within the archive would have been terribly startled. As though she had known that ITT would happen, her face turned stoic and she indifferently stared at the three guys. In that moment, they choked in their laughter as they shut their mouths. They looked to be in their 20s and were incredibly handsome. A French guy, a Spanish one, and an Indie-looking guy. Simultaneously named John, Pedro, and Sanjay. As soon as the professor left the exit through the exit of the archive, the three of them instantly burst out laughing with tears and falling from their eyes. But they didn't dare to face Brenda's fury either, so they quickly stifled their laughter. But the fact that Brenda got scammed by that professor was still incredibly funny to them. Do any of you recognize the boy with Frida? Brenda suddenly asked after they had calmed down. The boys simultaneously shook their heads, as they, and as us at the same time know, Jeffrey suddenly intercepted. They might be incredibly close to each other, or they might be friends judging from their behavior. Brenda frowned. Then she shook her head. Frida barely had any friends since she took job. She has been spending most of her time reading the books in the archives, trying to memorize as much books as she could, just in case she was removed from the position. I think he's just there to ask for directions from her. Sanjay blinked. Anand. And who would believe that? Pedro snickered. Before they could stay arguing, Brenda interjected. You guys stay here and watch him while I deal with something important first. A cold glint flashed in her eyes as she turned around to leave. Should we deal with him? He looks quite weak, though. Pedro blurted out. Brenda stood still as she pondered. No, let him be. It's been quite a while. Frida laughed last. Send the video recordings to Clinton. He would deal with him for us. No need to trouble ourselves further. The three guys suddenly shivered. Brenda, you as savage as usual. Yeah, I fear the day I might have to cross you. But Clinton is a very smart person. He wouldn't fall for such things. Of course he will notice, but he will have no other choice than to fall for the plan. As it is, I don't think he has ever made her smile. Frida has a lot of love interests, those who are willing to get close to her. The benefits are immense. She is very beautiful, and the most important, she is a receptionist at the archives. Stay and watch his movements. Update me if anything comes up. I will go deal with that professor. If he thinks he can just take my gyno points and get away with it, I will assist him in changing that mindset of his. Her eyes lit up in anger, but still, she was still incredibly beautiful. The boys sighed as they tuned down their lust, but Pedro wasn't a shy person to begin with. Should we head over to your room this night? He breathed roughly as he attempted to calm himself down, but he kept on failing. His eyes then turned into slits as they seemed to resemble that of a rattlesnake. A sudden emergence of an invincible wave burst out from his eyes, attempting to scan Brenda's body. Brenda did nothing as though she couldn't see the waves. The waves scanned her full body, from the chest, down to the bottom, and places which is supposed to remain hidden. Seemingly done with its job, the waves bounced back, attempting to send the signal and result of what it had scanned. Pedro's breathing got a notch rougher and faster. But as the waves were about to merge with his brain waves to send its results, there was a sudden swish. Puff! The waves was destroyed instantly, just like a smoke. Pedro glared angrily, attempting to fight it out with the person who ruined his moment. But all he saw was Brenda's cold eyes. He instantly calmed down. You boys won't be getting anything until this matter is settled. That's your punishment for attempting to use your genetic ability on me. After saying that, she turned around and left, but not without seductively swaying her hips. The boys instantly felt as if a cold water had been splashed on their heads. They angrily turned towards Pedro. This is all. So, if I get this straight, you are currently experiencing an heartlock? Frida said while squinting her eyes, scrutinizing him. I guess so, David replied with a slight hesitation in his voice. Anand, Frida replied as though she couldn't quite believe him. And this is also your first time experiencing this? She asked again. David sensed something wasn't quite right with the way things were going, but he didn't know what. So he answered, Yes, it's the first time I'm experiencing such things, so I got really worried. He frowned as he recalled the amount of repetitions he had gone through, but still, his heart failed to break past its limit even by a little amount. It was as if his heart, blood, and veins had been locked down by something, refusing to increase its blood circulation. That was why he was here currently. PPFD. A small laugh escaped her lips again, but as she tried stifling them with her hands, she accidentally sprayed some droplets of liquid crystal on David's face. David hurriedly closed his eyes, but he could do nothing about his face as he hadn't even expected something like this. He immediately grew angry. What type of situation is this? Does this young lady find everything funny to her or something? Glaring angrily at her. Are you even a consultant? He doubted. His heart began to grow. Which consultant bursts out laughing when her patient tells her about their problems? She's obviously lying. No. I mean, yes, of course I am. It's just that your problem is a bit funny to me and also very cute too. She chuckled. David's eyes widened in disbelief. Cute? Cute? Who calls a man cute? You can call me something else, but do not call me cute. Calming his mind, he asked, "What is funny about the fact that I am experiencing a problem which may very well be a crisis?" David almost roared at her face. "What with the little guy? Calm down, all right." She smiled as she calmed herself too. Then she said seriously, "How long was it since you had been admitted into the institute?" Seeing that she had finally turned serious, David pondered before responding too. "It should be almost a month now." He nodded as he confirmed that it really was almost a month. Frida didn't say anything as she just stared seriously at David. She didn't know if he was serious or if he was just joking. If he was joking, then it was a pretty good joke which had lightened up her mood. But if he was serious, then things would turn more serious than she had imagined. She suddenly leaned over the desk as she suddenly said, "What did you say your talent was again?" Looking at her suspiciously. "Am I even allowed to reveal that to someone else?" David replied, "Just answer the damn question." Her expression turned a total 360. She appeared really anxious. David's eyes flashed for a brief moment, but then his face turned expressionless as he replied, "Never mind me. I was just joking earlier. I have something to do, so I will see you later." After saying that, he turned around to leave. As he walked towards the exit, he could feel a big gaze watching him as he left. As he was about a few meters away from the exit, a semi-transparent bubble enveloped his surroundings, with him as the center. David's face immediately turned ugly. He turned around and he shouted, "What is the meaning of this?" David had read about the transparent barrier that enveloped him. It was a mid-level gadget which forms a delicate barrier that has the ability to absorb the surrounding color to camouflage and obscure the areas within the barrier. David glared at Frida from a distance, demanding for an explanation. And as Frida was about to explain, David's body shook, and surprisingly, his legs expanded by multiple folds. Bang! With the strength contained within his legs right now, he could easily stomp a mammoth to death with a single strike. But as his legs made contact with the ground, the floor didn't even shake as one might have expected. David's figure instantly flashed as his body was sent catapulting backwards with immense speed like an arrow imbued with air resistance. Whoosh! He was about to burst through the barrier to exit the archives when he suddenly heard a sigh. His spine tingled as the hairs on his neck stood on end. He instantly felt cold. It was his body warning him of danger. He roared loudly as he attempted to increase his speed when, coil, screech, a soft-like thing wound around his calf. His moving figure was suddenly pulled to a screeching halt almost instantly. It was a vine branch which had wound up around his feet. It was also moving upwards, trying to wound up his waist without giving him the slightest bit of opportunity to fight back. David instinctively knew that he couldn't let the vine reach his waist unless he would be doomed. In that instant, he propelled his blood with maximum velocity, pushing his blood, veins, and body to its limit. The blood within him flowed like a river within his veins as his heart pumped dark red blood into his system like a blood machine. Heat waves spread visibly from him, and the surrounding air distorted and the wind churned in fury. The heat seemed to want to burn almost everything surrounding him. Obviously feeling the intense heat, the vine started to loosen from his thigh. As he was about to sigh in relief, his face suddenly paled. Two purplish vines, which appears to be quite thicker than the first one, swept through the air as they wrapped around his waist and his arms, like an anaconda, as they began constricting themselves, squeezing his bones and flesh. David tried to struggle, but it was for naught. He suddenly heard Frida's voice. Frida stood at a corner of a bookshelf as she glanced at David with a smile. "Trying to leave, or are you planning on escaping?" "That was just wishful thinking. No one knows this yet, but in here I am God." She shrugged as though what she said wasn't anything surprising. David glared at Frida with his bloodshot eyes. Hesitation flickered in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He didn't know what this crazy lady was up to. His brain told him that the situation was quickly getting out of his control. He was mortal danger, but yet instincts told him otherwise. It had remained quiet throughout the ordeal. He hadn't sensed anything at all, which made him quite hesitant. As if he had made a decision, David suddenly spoke up. "Thinking about holding me here? Open for me." The heat waves in his body suddenly great and an orange color bathed him in their lights. It was as if there was an orange halo around him, although it wasn't clear at the moment, but the heat waves in his body had began to take in an orange hue. Crackle. The air in the surrounding bubble crackled with pure heat. As the distortion in space grew and the heat in the environment increased at a terrifying pace. It had never happened before, but David was too far gone to notice. Frida raised an eyebrow in surprise. This new student was interesting. If she was truly an evil person and truly didn't want to help him, she might just want to hold him hostage. Suddenly, David's figure trembled incessantly and his body turned a few shades red. Huge amount of red veins popped out from his body as though attempting to burst out from his body. Swish, swish. Blood revolved in his body with no end like an engine. It was as if his heart was an internal combustion engine as the strength in his body also gradually increased. The orange color of the heat wave began to grow more prominent, distorting the air with its force. His skin cracked as though about to break. His tendons shook and vibrated. His head streamed out steams of air. David gritted his teeth as he shouted in his head, "A little more, just a little more." David's mind suddenly turned blank as a bang went off in his heart. It was at this moment that the green vines receded back as they loosened their hold on him. But if one checked properly, one would see a few parts of the vines had been burnt black. Upon seeing this, Frida was stunned, and when she recovered, she turned towards David in anger. The vines were her most precious. She had nurtured them to be quite resilient, and with her resources, she was finally succeeded. But with the few charred sides of the vines would need to recuperate for a while, messing up her plans. And she would also have to spend a few gyno points to do that. She doesn't really have the time for all that. She still needed to read as much book as she could. David stood there blankly, as though he had lost his soul. He wasn't even aware of Frida's glare. He closed his eyes as he felt and observed his body. The blood in his body flowed more naturally in his veins, as if there wasn't anything forcefully pumping them to begin with. Everything flowed quite smoothly, and he felt that lock which had been preventing him from progressing also loosened its hold. His mind also felt cleared up, but it was in that moment he remembered his situation. As he was about to burst out with more power, he noticed that the situation had changed. The vines which had tied him up quite nicely was also gone. He cast a confused glance at Frida, who was currently glaring at him. A light bulb suddenly went off his head. Although he still didn't know what was going on, he could guess, and in the next moment, he tilted his head downwards as he said, "Thank you for your teachings. I'm incredibly sorry that I misunderstood you from the beginning." Upon hearing this, Frida calmed down a bit, and she nodded. At least this guy knows how to show his appreciation. Do not worry about it. The plan wouldn't have worked if you noticed anyway. That was my thanks to you for not letting me get into a tough situation. She cast a glance at the three men who were still angrily bickering with each other. They couldn't see her because of the camouflage effect of the barrier, but she could see them very clearly, but she didn't stare at them intently, just in case they noticed. Glancing back toward David, she explained, "Heart locks are common to Spryers. It usually only occurs a few weeks after you begin to practicing the exercising manuals. Yours just came a bit later than the others, is all. Unless you have been slacking off in your practice." Her voice deepened as she tried to sound intimidating, but it just made her cute. Shaking his head, "Of course not." He didn't think there would be a single student who would dare to slack off in the institute. "Well, I also think I should apologize for that." She sounded a bit guilty as she didn't dare look into his eyes. Her eyes shifted. She suddenly said, "The best way to clear a heart lock is to place oneself amidst danger, to naturally break past the heart lock, or—" David nodded his head as he pondered. He had experienced it first, and he could say with certainty that it works quite well and fine, but it would be very difficult if he wanted to that once again. He had almost cracked his veins, and there were small amounts of hidden wear and tears in his muscles, veins, and flesh. But they were slowly healing. It wouldn't take quite long to heal them fully. He then suddenly thought of something. He looked towards her, signaling for her to continue, but she just averted her gaze from him, refusing to look straight at him. David's eyes twitched as he pressed on, sighing, where you could just purchase a low-level heartbreaking serum from the Institute, she finally revealed in a low voice with her head lowered. David's lips quivered and his expression twisted. So he had suffered all this for naught. His lips opened up naturally to release the curse at the tip of his tongue, but he immediately stopped. He then turned around and left. He needed to heal his injuries, and also, if he stayed a moment longer, he didn't know just what his mouth would spill out. Frida watched with a worried face as David left without saying a word. "Come back again." David almost stumbled. "Like hell I would." But she didn't stop him and only mumbled, "I think I got too carried away. It was my first time being a consultant, so I was pretty excited." "Well, it worked anyways. That is all that matters." Her pretty smile returned to her face. If David heard her words, he would surely spit out a mouthful of blood from anger. What David didn't know was that breaking the heart lock by oneself was the most perfect way to advance. Using the serum would only expend one's talents, and if one were to become reliant on the serum each time they encounter a bottleneck, it would have an adverse effect instead. Although breaking the heart lock with a serum was normal, it was a known fact in the Institute that those who broke the lock by themselves amidst danger would surely grow more in power and mindset than those who had opened the lock with serums. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. There was a sudden ding sound. David stopped in his tracks. He turned on his holographic image as he checked his inbox for the message. The small smile on his lips disappeared, and his eyes turned expressionless. Another student dead. He gazed at the shimmering ray of light that had emerged from his wrist with coldness in his eyes. It has the 24th death since they had been in the Institute. At first, David felt that being here was heaven itself, but he didn't think so anymore. Every student in the Institute receive a message about the death of another student so as to remind them that they need to work hard and practice diligently to survive. Waving off the ray of light, David decisively headed towards the direction to the energy room. He had died once already. He swore to himself never to experience the process ever again. His main purpose of growing stronger was to eliminate the process, never having to pass through it once more. His first priority was to heal himself from his injuries. First, before beginning to practice, he had been delayed for a few days because of the heart lock. He wasn't sure the other students might have likely surpassed him in strength, but he was a little doubtful about it. As the numbers of time he that practices his exercising techniques is almost double that of his mates, he doubt if any of his new students could match up to him in strength. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Pedro had a pained expression on his face. His punishment had been decided by Jean and Sanjay already, which had put a stop to their argument. He wouldn't invite it into the room at night. He was extremely distressed. It would be quite painful to him. He stared hatefully at both Jean and Sanjay, and his heart burned with jealousy. Ignoring the both of them, he turned his head away, trying to distract himself. His eyes widened. Guys. Of course, they ignored him as they began to discuss their methods. Guys. They both turned around at the same time and simultaneously shouted, "What?" Pointing towards Frida. "Where is the Pa? Pa! Pop!" His bones popped, his muscles shivered, and his tendons stretched out with extreme flexibility. Clenching his fist, he could feel every muscles, veins, and cells in his body shiver in excitement, as they had just been soaked in the energy room for a few hours. His heart purred in satisfaction, and his blood flowed quite easily, although his strength didn't increase, as his body felt quite full of energy. His was at a stage where his strength wouldn't increase easily, and even if he were to soak inside the energy fluid for a whole day, his strength still wouldn't increase a single bit. As he exited the energy room, he received a message from his imprint. It was a message from the Institute saying that there was an emergency gathering the next day. His eyebrows furrowed as he thought. This was the very first emergency gathering, and David didn't know if it was a good or a bad thing. Thinking too much was usually his problem, so he just left it as it was. When he gets there, he would know. David dismissed the message as he turned around to leave. As soon as he entered his room, he slept off immediately. His snore resounded in his room. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When David woke up, the sun was almost up, but the weather was extremely cold. It appears as though it was winter already, but there wasn't snow, nor was there rain, but the weather was a bit cloudy. As soon as he finished cleaning himself up, he left his room, unhurriedly. He didn't head towards the cafeteria this time. He felt quite full of energy. He might just end up making himself more uncomfortable. Leisurely, he walked out of the dorm. He was in quite the good mood. He nodded his head at any and everyone he came across with. Soon, he spotted Nihia from a distance. David glanced at before he nodded his head. Nihia smiled. "You always leave immediately after class. It's been a while since I've seen you." Nihia grinned, and his white teeth with his long canine could be seen jutting outwards. With raised eyebrows, David said casually, "Why do you still keep up the facade? I assume you must be tired by now." He turned towards Nihia as he scrutinized him. "That doesn't seem to be the case." Nihia visibly froze. He gazed at David, trying to figure something out. David's eyes were normal, as though he didn't care. Both of them held their gazes for almost 30 seconds straight. Suddenly, Nihia bursted out laughing. "All right, you caught me," he said, but his expression changed instantly from his previous smiling face to just pure indifference. "When did you notice?" His tone was cold, freezing to the ears. It was like the warm-hearted Nihia wasn't there to begin with. "Does it matter?" David smirked as they continued to walk towards the distance. Nihia frowned. He needed to confirm something. A glint flashed in his eyes. "You sure are very stupid to get deceived for this long." Nihia mocked with a small laugh. Giving him a sidelong glance, David responded, "You don't need to instigate me." David snickered. "I found out during our first meeting. I just wasn't sure," he responded with disinterest. Nihia's frown deepened, and he replied, "That is impossible," obviously finding it very hard to believe. "Oh, why is that?" David chuckled. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Nihia appeared truly confused. David snorted, "Why would I?" David questioned back, while also mumbling, "I was too lazy to read the student's guide. So you think I have time for your nonsense?" He cast a disdainful glance at Nihia. Nihia finally kept quiet. He squinted his eyes as he observed David, but his expression soon turned indifferent. Silence reigned amidst the duo, which was immediately interrupted by the massive flow of students flooding in like a wave towards the large hall at a distance. The hall was unbelievably large, but it looked really old as the signs of time visibly shone. It looked as single fist stroke was all it would take to make it crumble to the ground. There was almost 1,000 students that stood outside the hall, discussing amongst themselves. The large hall was closed off, so they needed to wait for the hall to open and others to enter. David and Nihia stood in a corner near the hall, under a large tree. There was a sudden emergence of sound, and murmurs rose up among the students. "Isn't that Nyiming?" One of the youths suddenly spoke up. "The one currently ranked 5th in the rankings?" "Yes, that's right. I heard his sword palm can slice apart anything." A fierce-looking youth walked by as the crowds parted a way out for him. His was a Chinese youth that had practiced the sword palm combat technique to almost the perfection state. Utilizing the sword palm, he had severely injured the former student that was in the 5th rank position previously. And now, he had occupied the position in the ranking. He walked until he directly reached different of the door, and then he sat down, closing his eyes. The waves of murmur died down for a bit. David opened his eyes to check, then he closed them back. He was enjoying the breeze and the morning sun, while Nihia remained indifferent, as if the 5th rank position was nothing to him. There was a sudden racket in the crowds, obviously larger than the previous time. The cause of the racket was a black male student that seemed to originate from Africa. His skin color was all black and his body huge. He was a very handsome man with a punk haircut. His pupils were golden and they shimmered like starlights. On his face, 2 lines drawn horizontally on his right and on his left cheek, making them 2. They almost looked like tribal marks, but they appeared different. Lion King Sturm. The Lion King. The crowd of teenagers instantly drew back in fear. He was the undefeated. He placed 2nd on the rankings list. It was rumored that if it wasn't for the fact that the current number 1 on the rankings list remained unknown, it was certain he would have grabbed the 1st place from that person. I heard that his blood cycle had reached a terrifying 1 cycle per second. A teen whispered. "Really? Then doesn't that mean he could advance to the next stage anytime soon?" Rumor has it that he killed the previous guy who was placed 2nd on the rankings list, someone suddenly said. Immediately, the person's surroundings cleared as if no one had been there. The person was obviously not stupid. He left the specific area with them too. Sturm's eyes flashed with a cold light as he looked towards that direction. But the area was already empty, and even if it weren't, there were a lot of students there. Since he couldn't find the specific person that said those words, he obviously couldn't beat everyone there. It was the same as courting death. Upon hearing the whispers, David glanced at Sturm's direction. He immediately recognized the fella. It was the guy who had almost crushed him a few weeks ago. His eyes suddenly flashed with a cold light. Then he smirked. 1 cycle per second on. As if feeling something, Sturm turned around and faced toward David's location. Suddenly, as though he recalled something funny, Sturm chuckled. Then he brought his hands to his stretched neck. He forcefully swiped his thumbs across his neck, cutthroat. David indifferently glanced at him from the distance before retracting his gaze. But deep inside, he had marked Sturm down on his kill list. That person obviously wanted to kill him, so he deserves to die for that thought. As he was about to rest his back towards the branch, the corner of his eyes caught onto a figure, and before he could truly see who it was, the figure was submerged into the seas of crowds. David unconsciously squinted his eyes, searching, wanting to see that figure again, but it was all in vain. Suddenly, an indifferent voice spoke out, "What is wrong with you?" Nihia had a slight, surprised expression as he asked. "What do you mean?" Puzzled, David reluctantly turned away as he gazed at Nihia. With furrowed brows, he replied, "Your breathing got rougher for just a moment." Taken aback, David checked to confirm, and indeed his breathing got rougher. Even his heartbeat was stronger than previously. But the most important aspect was that he didn't even notice. He waved his hands dismissively. "I was just slightly circulating my blood. Don't mind me." After saying that, he sat down to rest on a branch. Nihia had an expression which practically said, "Do you take me for a fool?" David didn't reply, though, as he already knew the reason his body reacted in such a way. It is that girl again. There are also some pretty important figures that were supposed to seen and discussed about, but from the looks of things, it was obvious they had hidden carefully amongst the crowds, not wishing for attention. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the old hall, several figures sat in a high platform at a far distance from the dilapidated door, and they kept staring at several spots on the metal door, as if there was something special on there. It appears BAS if they had the ability to see through the doors, which shows how powerful they are. They sat in the shape of a V as a white-haired middle-aged man could be seen seated at the forefront, while there were 2 people seated directly at his left and right-hand side. Other people were also seated besides them. There seems to be a few talents amongst this group of students. Someone spoke up. "That's right. But the trick we pulled regarding the early posting of the rankings list caused quite the commotion amongst the new student. The rankings list was a mess for a few weeks." Another elder spoke up. Of course it would, but it has already been corrected. The owners of the rankings had taken back what was originally theirs. Another middle-aged woman spoke up. Then she pointed toward the direction. If one could see through the door, one would notice that he was pointing directly at a female student. That girl is called Janine Fox, and although she is currently ranked 10th on the list, she had almost mastered her shockwave palm to perfection. She only needs a few pointers, and she would perfect the combat technique. The other elders nodded their heads. She does indeed have potential. She is only ranked 10th in the rankings. What potential does she have? Someone suddenly snorted. The previous elder's face turned red from embarrassment, and, as she was about to defend her, the person spoke up once more. "You obviously can't compare her with Philida. She has a 3-star talent and had practiced her brown grade combat technique to the 2nd level, which shows highly on her perception." The elder spoke proudly with excitement in his eyes, and he pointed toward the figure clearly hidden amongst the crowds, and at the same time, he glanced towards the middle-aged, white-haired man who was seated at the forefront to see if he was listening, but was disappointed as the senior professor face was expressionless. There was no sign that he was listening. They were trying to promote their family's kids in front of the senior professor just in case he was looking to choose a disciple. "Professor, the higher-ups demands that you chose a disciple this time, or they might be forced to randomly select one for you." An old man professor who was seated at the right seat of the white-haired man spoke. The white-haired man rose his head, and he responded, "Let it be. When it's time to choose a disciple, I will naturally select one for myself," he said indifferently. Another middle-aged lady elder seated directly on his left side swiftly spoke up. They seemed pretty serious about it this time. The white-haired man frowned a bit as he pondered. Then I will just select the student that places first in the events. The group of elders were obviously stunned, and they instantly shouted, "Senior, you can't do that. My decision is final. Don't try to persuade me." After a while, the death count is only 24 in the past 3 weeks. This batch of students are obviously sicker than in the previous ones. A middle-aged lady suddenly spoke. They are truly weaker. I don't think half of them would survive the event. Another supported. Several figures nodded their heads in acknowledgement, but a voice cut them off. "Jerkins, what do you mean weaker? Do you want to see them killing each other like dogs before you find them strong enough?" An old voice retorted, obviously angry with their thoughts. The previous batch had more than 100 death counts in the first few weeks of being in the institute, which made the students battle-hardened and strong-minded because of their intense competitions. But the drawbacks were obvious. Many potential talents died off during the process, leaving the institute at quite a loss. The old man didn't want that to happen again, so he was obviously happy to see such small amounts of death rate. The others quickly shut their mouths as they withdrew their heads. The middle-aged lady, Kenny Jerkins, but as a professor, they would only be called by their surnames. The middle-aged lady sneered as she replied, "Jeremy, the older you get, the more softer you seem to become." The old man's expression darkened instantly when he heard her words. "Don't drag me into this. We're talking about the institute and its students, not me. If the amount of students dwindled by the same amount as last year, do you think the institute would sit still this time?" This finally shut her up. The white-haired man suddenly pipped in its time. "Open the gates." The group instantly responded in a loud and synchronized voice. "Yes. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." After a few minutes, the doors to the large building suddenly trembled, and then, with a groan, the doors forcefully opened slowly and steadily. The crowds instantly turned to look as murmurs and all sorts of noises filled the air. Both David and Nihia also turned to stare at the piece of crap metal they called door open. Rays of sunlight instantly pierced through the entrance, revealing a couple of people who stood still at the entrance. A slightly old man suddenly shouted in a deep voice, "Quiet!" The crowds of teenagers instantly felt their heads buzzed as though the sound of a horn had rung beside their ears, and they felt lightheaded. David was no exception, and likewise Nihia. David forcefully propelled his blood in his body. Strength returned to him as the force from forcefully circulating his blood countered the buzzing sensation. David observed his surrounding, and he noticed that he wasn't the only one to have recovered. Nihia also recovered just as David observed his surrounding, and he noticed that he wasn't the only one to have recovered. Nihia also recovered just a second after him. His eyebrows furrowed. Several students also seemed to have recovered from the stunning noise, and they used the opportunity to estimate the strength of other students. Across from the crowd, from a distance, a blond youth suddenly held gazes with him, and in a split second, coldness flashed his eyes, but he outwardly smiled and waved towards David as though they were friends. Then he glanced at Nihia and retracted his gaze. Dav only responded with an indifferent glance. When the figure had looked at him earlier, he felt as though he had been locked onto by a cold and sinister viper snake. But David didn't even have to do anything, and the feeling died down itself. His formless heat wouldn't allow any foreign energy in them, and only seek to destroy or devour. As expected, there are hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the Institute. David then heard a chuckle by his side. It had been Nihia. "That guy is interesting." He licked his lips as excitement shone in his eyes. As he looked towards that blond guy's direction, the old man, Professor Jeremy, smiled as he nodded his head in approval. There were a lot more people who recovered in less than 3 seconds than he had expected. He could finally put his mind to peace. They were obviously stronger than they seem. "You may enter the hall," the old man who was currently standing said. The students at the forefront, those who had publicly shown themselves, moved first as they entered into the hall. Soon after that, the remaining students rushed in like a wild flood. When that had been settled, the old man lamented. This old building had been personally built by the founder's very own hands when the institute had first been created. Sighing, he continued, "This building indicates our survival through all hardships, and never to forget the pain and sacrifices we had to pass through to get to where we are today." He gazed at the students as though they were his children. "It's been a few weeks since you all have been admitted to this very institute, and I must say, we are both happy and proud to have you join us," he smiled gently. "You must have experienced quite the hardship and pain being in the institute. I get it. I feel your pain and also your sorrow. But you must preserve and stand strong. If you willed your mind to it, you can achieve anything." The old man's tone grew strong as he continued. Most of the students glanced at each other blankly. What pain? What sorrow? What is with this situation? David blinked, as he also didn't know what was going on. Was the old man sympathizing with them? They obviously don't need it. As the old man was about to continue, the white-haired man coughed lightly. "Get on with it." Clearing his throat in embarrassment, the old man continued, "Ahem. The Institute has decided to open a 1-week survival and hunting event that every new student must participate in. It is a competition and a test to observe and notice those with hidden talents and potential we might have missed. Now, the main theme of this event is killing." The students were obviously stunned, as this was the first time they heard of such things. "The evolved beasts in the location of the event are numerous and quite wild. You should be very careful when dealing with them, and a single mistake made might possibly be the last one you would ever make. So do be careful," the old man said with a serious expression. Even though the previous students had gone through the process, the Institute had insisted they sign a non-disclosure agreement, forbidden from ever speaking to it to any new students. It has been decided that the students would leave when they least expected it, and the less prepared the students are, the better it would be. Although it sounds unfair, when in a real battle, you'll be unable to speak out the word unfair after you're dead. This was the message the higher-ups were trying to pass across. Not waiting for the students to digest the information, his voice sounded out once more. "Now, the higher the numbers if REBs killed, the better. And if you're lucky enough to get first place in this event, there would be a very enticing rewards in store. The reward system has been sent over to your computer. Check them out while you can. The event will be starting in." Checking his watch, he raised his head and stated 15 minutes. "What?" The students instantly shouted as a clamor overcame the surroundings. The noise was deafening. It was simply too outrageous. Even if they wanted to open an event for the students, they should have been informed earlier, at least to get ready. Even with the loud noise from the crowds of students, the old man's voice sounded more prominent. "No need to panic. We have everything you would need over there, including your daily basic necessities. Everything has been dealt with." The students instantly quieted down. They had no choice. Their ears had almost been wounded by the old man's loud voice. He had used the weird ability again. Instructions has been sent over to everyone's imprint. Check your inboxes and you would see them. Read the instructions very carefully and observe every one of them. Although the event rarely contains any brown-grade beasts, the black-grade evolved beasts aren't that easy to deal with, he warned. "Now, I will give you the basic overview of situation you'll have to face when you get dropped off to the location the event will take place. Then for the next 10 minutes, he went ahead to explain the rules of the match. He repeatedly warned as he instructed them to be more careful. David listened very intently as the old man continued speaking. He had been very surprised and obviously stunned when he heard all of it. It was news to him that the Institute would release them to kill off evolved beasts, but wasn't it just too early for them? He wasn't the only one thinking like this, too. There were several other students on the same page as him. But there was obviously nothing they could do to change the situation. All of a sudden, the white-haired man spoke up. "It is time to depart. Oh, just in case, I will be selecting anyone who places first in the event as a personal intern, so do your best." The crowd suddenly boiled over in excitement as whispers sounded out. Isn't that Senior Professor White? A senior professor suddenly deciding to choose a personal intern during event? I must become his personal intern at all cost. With that meager power of yours, do you think you would have any chance at it? Someone snorted. I will certainly try my luck, the person huffed, while some elders cursed in their minds, as the elders had already secretly informed some of the youths they had favored or those that were of the same family as them about the news, and already started a plan on taking advantage of the situation and those ignorant students to group up with their representatives. But now that the announcement had been made public to the crowds of youths, making use of the ignorant would be quite hard, and getting first place wouldn't be as easy more. Isn't that the old man back at the energy room? David's eyebrow rose. He evidently recognized the white-haired man who had spoke up and was currently standing on the platform. Then he snorted as he glanced disdainfully at the old man. See him acting like a big shot. Personal intern my foot, he snickered. The white-haired man suddenly frowned, and he looked over at his direction. David was taken aback at first when he saw the white-haired man look towards him, but he naturally composed himself, and he rolled his eyes at him. The white-haired man was a little surprised upon seeing who it was. Then, having thought of something, he suddenly smiled and nodded subtly towards David's direction. The smile barely visible, and the nod was short and almost imperceptible to notice, but those with sharp minds perceived it, and David also saw through it. His expression turned ugly as he discerned several visions landed on his figure, giving him goosebumps. He shivered as he angrily gazed at the petty, old, and shameless white-haired old man. You personally know Professor White? Nihia questioned, noticeably very surprised. Who? The old man? We have only just met once, and he almost tricked me. David huffed. Nihia frowned. He didn't know what to say, so he changed the subject. You are quite deep in trouble this time, referring to the malicious glances that had turned David's way. David's eyes flashed with a cold light. They're only flirting with disaster if they think I am that easy to deal with. And his gaze hardened. Upon exiting the large hall, the students were greeted by 15 massive and dreadful-looking sky cruisers. They were horrifyingly frightening, as the ghastly air they seemed to give off was spine-chilling. The sky cruisers were pure black in color, giving off a metallic sheen. They were in shapes of various powerful flying beasts, with two beastly claws as the landing gear, supporting the whole craft from the air. Thick, finely lined-up scales neatly covered up the body of the sky cruisers with the two outstretched wings installed with an omnidirectional thrusters underneath them. The forefront of the sky cruiser was just like the head of an eagle with a sharp beak that seemed to want to pierce through anything like a sharp sword, and the two eyes in front that seemed to stare menacingly at everyone no matter how much you tried dodging its gaze. It was as if they had downed the sky cruiser with the flesh of an evolved beast. In fact, it wasn't really that far off from the truth. They had skinned the corpses of brown-grayed, evolved beast. When David saw it, his heart immediately skipped a beat. The aura was intimidating. He was only able to shrug off the effect after a while, and as he scrutinized the aircraft, he recognized the beast one of the craft seemed to portray. The only problem was it should be practically impossible for that beast to grow this large. A falcon. Although he wasn't 100% sure, he could still say with certainty that it was a gerfalcon. But the one before him was way too huge. It might as well be an imitation. All right, students. Your seat number has been sent to you. The first letter represents the sky cruiser you would enter, while the numbers represent your seat number. You have only 2 minutes to settle down. Good luck. The old man said his final piece, tapping on his imprint. Hazel, what's my plane and seat number? David mentally asked. It had been a while since he had spoken with Hazel using his brainwave, and that was because of the side effects it would bring if he abused using it. His brain activities would start to deteriorate, and his thinking faculties would inevitably decline. That was the reason why he rarely used it. But in this competition that was about to take place, he would have to utilize the AI with the best of its capabilities. The AI responded immediately, a 12, with its sweet but robotic voice. He then turned toward Nihia. Mine is 12. What's yours? Nihia responded almost immediately, G14. He turned his indifferent eyes towards David as he said, We will meet over there, It sounded like a statement, but almost like a question. David's lips curled up, sure. And after saying that, Nihia turned around and left with an arrogant vibe. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It's been almost a month now, and you have found out absolutely nothing. The elder scolded as his face was scrunched up in anger. Phillida lowered her head, but her face was beautiful and sharp. She wasn't intimidated at all, as she stood elegantly before the elderly man, and she still replied, "He had been wary of me ever since the first time we met. I just gave him enough time for that feelings to fade before making my move." Raising her head slightly, she pressed on. "If I still continued, it might have an adverse effect and may possibly backfire. Do not worry, Elder. I know how important this is to you, and I will make sure to find out every single detail from him in this competition." Phillida said resolutely, and her golden eyes glinted with coldness. Upon hearing this, the elder instantly calmed down. "Good, and that is that. Now the most important matter, you must absolutely place first in the competition at all cost. Do you understand? This is also about the well-being of the clan and the orders from the clan master," the elder said in a solemn tone. She was instantly taken aback. "Clan head came back already?" "Hm. He came back a week ago. I've informed him about this matter, and he was quite serious about it." The elder nodded and said deeply. Phillida could tell he was very serious, and also nodded her head quite seriously. The elder was about to leave, but then he hesitated. "Use that thing if you have to." Her mouth popped open in surprise. She was stunned and didn't even know when the elder had left. She was only meant to use it when in grave danger, but now that the elder said they could use it, doesn't that mean she could possibly die there? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In a different place, at a secluded corner of the hall, several youths could be seen standing at a distance from the sky cruisers, and one was a red-haired, beautiful young lady with cherry-like lips and soft skin. It was silent as the breeze blew by. One of the youth suddenly broke the silence. "I still don't understand why you hid your face from the public," B said, speaking to the blue-haired youth before him, genuinely confused. By the rankings, the blue-haired youth was already the number one on the rankings list. That means that he was the strongest amongst this batch of new students. But since then, the blue-haired had been silent ever since then. He refused to show his face to the public after he had fought the previous student that was in the position before him. The blur-haired youth was Lu Feng. Lu Feng remained silent for a few seconds before he responded. "Do you know how many students entered was admitted into the institute?" Lu Feng asked. Genian and the others looked at each other before replying. "By my calculations, it should be 892 students." Lu Feng instantly laughed mockingly at those words. Naive words. The others frowned, and someone else swiftly asked, "You mean to say there are even more people than the number count?" Lu Feng nodded in acknowledgement. The others were instantly stunned. They didn't know this sort of information. Lu Feng took in a deep breath, and he continued, "These people do not care about rankings or whatnot. All they do is practice, and the resources needed had already been accounted for. A meager 10,000 gyno points for the first place is not nearly enough for them to make a move." The youth's eyes opened wide in surprise. This was definitely bad news. When Lu Feng had heard that piece of information from the underground world, he had been dispirited and had almost gave up all hope. But he wasn't that weak-minded, so he had recovered quickly. He was arrogant by nature. He wouldn't let anything stop him and from his deductions. He would have a chance at fighting evenly or even beat them if he saw one of them, as they wouldn't have enough combat experiences to fight. But that's impossible. Who would provide the resource for them? How would they get the gyno points they would need to survive? Sumiyomi immediately questioned. Lu Feng arrogantly gave the person a sidelong glance. "Do you have the authority? You can go ahead and question the institute." The youth instantly shrank back. Lu Feng had almost gotten himself into problems for eavesdropping such sensitive information in the underground world. While we are here fighting with our lives on the line to be on the rankings, they're laughing at us for our ignorance," Lu Feng said as he clenched his fists tightly at the humiliation. The others clenched their teeth in anger, while Janine scrunched up her beautiful face. "I don't believe that they could take on the full power of my shockwave palm attack." Lu Feng glanced at her, but didn't say anything. Just be careful when you fight. The others nodded their head. Let's move. Yes. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In several secluded corners in the surroundings of the old hall, several figures could be seen secretly giving some items to the students who would soon be set to leave to the event ground. We should be stopping things like these from happening, but it's the same things every year. The old professor, Prof. Jeremy, complained with a frown on his face as they gazed at the students from the hall. The other elders who were beside him gave him a reproaching look. Some of them had sent their people to hurriedly give their youths a few items to survive with, as it wasn't against the Institute's rules. They quickly turned glanced at the senior professor, and although some of them were at least a few years older than him, they still haed him the respect of a senior professor. The white-haired man then shook his head and said, "Let them be. Those who would survive, and those who won't come back." He said indifferently. The elders quickly heaved a sigh of relief. If the white-haired man had forbidden the students from accepting the items, they would have no other choice but to follow orders and confiscate items. Things would definitely be bad by then. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. David stared at the entrance of the sky cruiser with remnants on his face, and after a while, he turned decisive as he entered without hesitation in his movements along with several other students. There was nothing in him except the clothes he was wearing. 12, 12, 12. Wriggling through the crowds of students, David began to search for his seat number, and very soon, he found his seat. Found it! Settling in his seat, he sat comfortably. It was almost as comfortable as his bed back at his dorm. DAV smiled at the thought. The sky cruisers were huge, so it contained about 200 to 300 students. The arrangements of the seat was almost similar to that of an airplane. The only difference was that the line of the seats wasn't exactly horizontal. As David rested comfortably into his seat with his eyes shut, he suddenly heard a sound from the seat beside him. It was different from the ruckus caused by the other students. He could guess the owners if the seat beside him had occupied it. All of a sudden, a burst of fresh fragrance entered into his nose. He inhaled deeply, and it seemed to remind him of the smell of wild strawberry, a hint of violet, some jasmine, and something else in the mix. It made him want to relax his mind and body. Suddenly, David opened his eyes as he looked at the person who had occupied the seat beside him, and he was immediately taken aback. "Hello, David. We meet again." Phillida smiled sweetly. "Hello, David. We meet again." Phillida smiled sweetly. Although thief seats were a few distance away from each other, he could still smell the fragrance coming off her. Blinking his eyes, David was silent for a few seconds. His lips suddenly curled up as he smiled. "Hello, Phil." She was a little taken aback, obviously stunned by his reply. She had expected him to resist for just a little bit. She hadn't expected things to go quite smoothly, and the idiot had even shortened her name. He is truly foolish, she thought. At this moment, she even felt as though he had ignored her back then so as to gain her curiosity. She snickered, and her golden eyes held a tinge of disdain within. She quickly responded, "You remember me?" she asked, as though that had been the main reason she had been stunned. David looked towards her with a smirk. "Of course." Then he looked downwards toward her laps. There was a small, compact backpack on it. "I thought we weren't expected to bring anything along with us," David asked with raised eyebrow. With a beautiful smile, Phillida responded slyly that it didn't say it was forbidden. As soon as she said those words, a loud voice reverberated from the surroundings. It was almost unbearable. "Everyone, please make sure placing your seat hold, as those without seat holds on will all be electrocuted within 10 seconds. The voice spoke coldly, but it also had a tinge of excitement within. It was as though the owner of the voice was looking forward to the students disobeying his words. 9. David blinked his eyes. 8. The other students were perplexed. 7. Phillida swiftly pivoted the soft, triangular iron shaft at the top of her seat and moved it flatly on her shoulders and chest, just like a vest. 6. Then she gracefully fastened the ends to the straps on the seats by her waist. 5. The voice was audibly excited as it continued its count. 4. Phillida then looked towards David. 3. She raised her eyebrows with what she saw. It was unknown when, but David had already placed himself within his seat hold and resting his head. She had thought he wasn't going to listen, but he did listen. 2. The students had already placed in their seat holds, keeping their bodies in place within the seat. The male voice didn't even count to 1 yet. Suddenly, 5 students shook vigorously as they screamed out in pain. Electric arcs flowed from the chair to their bodies as the current passed into their bodies. Electric arcs flashed through the air as more than 100 joules of electricity flowed into the students, and they screamed out in pain. This shows how desperate and excited the voice in the plane was to see the students scream out in pain. There were more than 5 who were but the other students gritted their teeth to hold in the pain. It must be known that people who are stubborn are truly stubborn until the end. Even when in pain, they refuse to give the voice in the sky cruiser the sense of satisfaction to see them in pain. Damn it, it wasn't even 10 seconds yet. The students couldn't help but shout out loud in pain and anger. He was only teasing the owner of the voice, as he could guess the owner of the voice was watching them, judging by the excitement from a voice. He had planned on put his seat hold on in the last second, but who wild have expected the voice to lie? This was plain cheating. Ha ha. Yes, that is what I'm talking about. Scream your lungs out. Ha ha ha. Although the students were screaming in pain, none of them were stupid. In fact, among the students in the institute, only 20% could be stupid, but almost everyone was smart. Gritting his teeth, a guy quickly swung his iron seat hold over his head and did his straps. As soon as he did that, his body stopped shaking and he breathed in a sigh of relief. As soon as that happened, other students also copied his movements, and soon enough, there weren't any students screaming out in pain anymore. Obviously disappointed, the voice grunted. Just make sure to read the instructions sent to you. The voice dismissively, as though it wasn't important. But the majority of the students on board aren't stupid and had learnt their lessons. For the voice to mention reading the instructions so dismissively meant that it was very important, and even if it wasn't, most had planned on viewing the rewards listed for each place position in the competition anyway. The voice grunted again in displeasure as he saw various students opening up their systems as various lights pierced through the air. Others can't hope to read another's hologram, except if the person purposely allowed it, since it had been programmed according to each person's genetic codes. David opened up his system, and he checked the Institute's homepage. Clicking on them, he saw the instructions and began to read them seriously. But after a few seconds, he grunted as he rested his head on his seat. He was already having a headache. He honestly doesn't love to read books as far as they weren't novels. He hates them, even getting stronger didn't help with that. Frowning slightly, he ignored the feeling as he forced himself to read. There were different things the instructions stated, which were things like be careful of this and that. David drilled past those ones, but something suddenly caught his eyes. He frowned as he had seen this word been repeated over and over and over again in various parts of the instruction page. And that word was really getting to him as his body was giving off the same weird sensation. The first instruction, before the drop, make sure to select the exact position in the map in which you wish to touch down on. The third instruction, before the drop, it is advisable to keep circulating one's exercising method to be ready for any unexpected surprises. The seventh instruction, there are various safe zones on various parts of the map. Selecting one should be the priority before the drop. Although the word came out in 3 instructions out of 7, but it still gave David a weird feeling. All of a sudden, his eyes glinted as though he had though of something after that. He dropped the instruction book back in his inbox and took the map sent to him by the Institute. Buzz. Hum. But before he could do that, there was a sudden humming sound emanating from TH Sky Cruiser. The Sky Cruiser rose into the air slowly, but David could his body getting lighter as his shirt floated in the air. Surprised, David blamed around and noticed that he wasn't the only one experiencing such phenomenon. Shriek! All of a sudden, a high-pitched, piercing bird cry rang out from the Sky Cruiser, dazing the students with its loud sound. The hymn instantaneously increased as the Sky Cruiser seemed to vibrate intensely. Whoosh! Wings spread, the engine revolved, the thrusters buzzed. It flew. By the time David and the other recovered, they were already in the air. Phillida shook her head. She was still feeling a bit dizzy, but she had recovered. She glanced at David and saw that he was still in a daze, even after most of the students already recovered. She was truly disappointed in her heart. As expected, he was truly very weak. She had expected and had thought that he would be a challenging task to handle, and he could even have the power to struggle with her for a few moves, but she had to expected him to be this weak. Then she saw David held his head with his hand as he groaned slightly. "Are you okay?" Phillida asked worriedly. Glancing at her, he nodded his head. "Yes, thanks for asking." "That sound was truly too loud," he complained. Phillida's eyes was filled with disdain as she went back to her system. Not minding her, David only smirked and also went back to his system to check on the location of the maps he would like to land in. David was instantly taken aback. The map was a very large one, and David concluded that if he were to use all of his strength to run from one end of the map to the other end without rest, it would take him at least a few months to get there, and that was if he didn't rest, which was completely impossible. Checking the map again, he saw that the map was that if a large city, which was already in ruins and was infested with evolved monsters of various kinds and human mutants without any sentience left. There were 7 safe zones which was in the map, and were colored blue, while the location colored red was infested with evolved monsters. There are also other colors in the map, but the one that got to David was on a wretched, infested yellow hue. Zooming in, the word was written in a huge capital letter. Radiation zone, only accessible with a combat suit. David frowned deeply when he saw the description. Because the radiation zones on the map were numerous, tabbing about 30% of the entire map, but those were the places most evolved mutants settled in. But the most troublesome part was that those radiation zones were the places marked with the gold color, which signifies high-quality supply zones. But David's frown loosened a bit, and that was because there were other supply zones marked on the map. Silver marked zone represents a mid-tier supply zones, while those locations marked with bronze color signifies a low-tier supply zone. The locations on the map marked with bronze color weren't too far away from the safe zones, so it would be quite easy to get enough supplies from that location. Rubbing his non-existent chin, David scrutinized the entire map, and from there, he started to strategize his own plan. He firstly marked the location at which he wished to drop subtly, and from there, he marked the routes which he would take, which would require him to touch entirely different parts from his drop location. David wasn't the only one who was busy selecting his drop zone. Other students were also making their own selection as the sky cruiser flew in the air. David glanced at his side and saw Phillida wearing a solemn and contemplative look while staring at the rats of light before her. David took back his gaze and he rested his body in the seat. After a while, he heard Phillida spoke up. "I didn't really get the chance to properly introduce myself. I was originally from Sector B-76. How about you? What sector were you from?" Phillida said as she placed her backpack on the ground by her legs. David's eyes twitched, and he tilted his head up. "I don't even know who my families are supposed to be. How would I know where I lived?" David grumbled in his mind, but outwardly, he smiled at Phillida, and he replied, "Does that really matter?" Phillida's body froze slightly, but she nodded her head positively. You're quite right. It truly doesn't matter," she answered in a weird tone. Before David could talk, the sky cruiser suddenly trembled violently, and then its speed suddenly increased by a notch. Suddenly, the craft swayed sharply to the left again. There was a sudden booming sound as though something has been blasted into pieces. Shriek! The high-pitched cry rang out again, but to David and the other students, it wasn't so kid anymore since the captain of the cruiser had activated a silencing gadget. The sways of the cruise continued as the sky cruiser was seemingly dodging something. All of a sudden, there was a violent crash, and the cruiser was forcefully halted in the air, ricocheting backwards a few meters. In the center of the cruise, Captain Steve suddenly stood up as he said in a cold voice which held a gunge of excitement within. He had thought this was going to be a boring ride, but he had never expected to be attacked by 3 brown blaze evolved beasts. It was a delightful moment for him. "All right, Lieutenant, get off my ship. This baby needs Daddy's touch to perform better." The lady who was previously dodging the attacks from the beast rolled her eyes as she swiftly pressed the autopilot mode, and she took the helmet off her head. Rubbing his hands gleefully, Steve took the helmet and placed it in his head. Instantly, huge amount of data streamed into his head as his brainwaves was forcefully merged with something else. His body shuddered from either fear or excitement as a surge of euphoria blasted into his body. In a split second, the stream of messy data instantly organized themselves, and he could clearly see what those data were. It's been a long time, baby. The captain smirked while the others in the cabin snickered. Wasn't it yesterday he rode the cruiser last? Why is he acting as if it had been a few years ago month? The cruiser spun as it moved backwards due to the kinetic energy as the two-clawed mutant pigeon took the opportunity to land another attack after the brief second pause, lashing its snake-like tail at the cruiser. Whoosh! The cruiser forcefully stabilized itself in the air as the thrusters under its wings forcefully let out multiple streams of energy to counter its backwards momentum. Activating its thrusters, it swayed lightly, shifting its position, barely dodging the snake-like tail that had swept towards its direction. Angry at then like a nimble sparrow, the cruiser maneuvered over to the back of the beast. The two-clawed mutant pigeon was too slow to react, and before it knew it, the war machine had arrived behind it. There was a sudden mechanical sound that had emerged from and then a rectangular hole appeared by the two sides of the cruiser, revealing 6 sets of muzzles. 3 each by the flank, by both sides of the sky cruiser. A slight hum echoed, as though the weapon was storing energy within. And then, rat, ta, 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 ta. Bullets as big as an arm poured out from the muzzles like rain as it tore the air. The two-clawed mutant pigeon was only able to shriek out in a piercing manner before it was down by the bullets. Sounds of explosions rang out as the each arm-long bullets hit the two-clawed mutant pigeon dead on. Boom, 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 boom. Instead of the sounds of the flesh being pierced through, it was the sound of explosions that rang out. Each bullets seemed to possess the power of a missile as explosions rang out repeatedly through the air, drowning the beast with a fiery flare. Stopping its attack, the sky cruiser retreated backwards for a moment, as though to observe the piece of art it had made. Captain Steve smiled as looked expectantly to see the beast dying in its pool of blood, but soon his expression froze when the fiery heat cloud in the sky faded. The beast was instantly revealed. It had multiple holes on its body as though it had been stabbed multiple times by huge spears. A red glow began to emit from its eyes, which seemed to have a tinge of yellow within. If it were another person, they would think the beast was only very angry, but Steve was an experienced captain. He knew what it thus meant. A red blaze evolved beast would usually have a red glow from its eyes, but if it were to be mixed with the color orange, then that means... Steve's expression was ugly as he muttered to himself. This mutant beast has reached the peak of red blaze and is about to advance to the next stage, the orange glow, as its eyes already had a tinge of orange in it. Evolved beasts could be measured according to their power levels. The lowest rank evolved beast is the dark blaze mutant, in which the color of its eyes is pure black without any tinge of whiteness. The next rank is the brown shade mutant, in which the color of its eyes are brown in color. The same goes for the red blaze beast too. Evolved beast could also be graded according to the amount of radiation level they emit. Scanning them for the radiation level was a very simple matter. As long as one was a few hundred meters away from the beast, the scan could be taken. But the scanning distance could also be increased if one had better equipments. Scanning a few kilometers wouldn't be a problem. Before selecting this location for appropriate for the competition to take place, the Institute had scanned the entire map of its radiation level and had determined that it was a suitable location. The two-clawed mutant pigeon's eyes reddened as the glow within its sayas increased. With a sudden shriek, the air tumbled as a shock wave was produced, rushing towards the ship. Steve's face darkened as he instantly shouted, "Activate the quantum energy at full power. We need to get the hell out of here." Dealing with a red blaze beast was an easy feat for Steve as long as he merged his brainwave with the sky cruiser's electric charges. He could handle the situation. but a red blazo beast about to advance to the red glow stage. The sudden increase on strength wasn't something he could handle even if he had more rounds of ammo of that special bullets. Not stupidly waiting for the beast to recover, nor for the shock wave to hit home. Steve maneuvered the ship as the ship trembled in pure force. Whoosh. The sky cruiser suddenly took off, leaving two white streams of combustible energy which had recessed off the thrusters. A cold light flashed within the two-clawed mutant pigeon's eyes. Scree! It let out a high-pitched cry, and its wings suddenly trembled. Although the holes in its body was bleeding pre-fusal, the monster didn't seem to care as it set its eyes on the ship whose figure was about to disappear onto the horizons. The reddish-orange glow seemed to spread from its eyes to its wings, and the surrounding clouds tumbled and rolled as though there was something summoning them. Its body seemed to absorb the surrounding clouds, and then, with a single flap of its wings, the air behind the beast trembled and minute bits of clouds were blasted from its back, propelling it forwards like it was a booster in itself. It had instantly activated its skill without caring for its price at this moment. Cloud blast! The bird was immediately propelled forwards, and with a single flap of its wings, the gap between the two-clawed mutant pigeon and the sky cruiser immediately shortened. Since Steve had the helmet on, his vision was a whole 360 wide, and he could see everything happening within a radius of half a kilometer. He noticed the beast closing in on them. He cursed their luck, and he accelerated the cruiser forwards as it pierced through the clouds like a dragon with terrifying speed. David and the other students held on to their seats as the cruiser moved through the air, trembling like a roller coaster. Although David wasn't aware of what was going on, it didn't take a genius to understand that they were under attack. The other students were also able to deduce the facts as they leaned tightly on their seats. But David wasn't the least bit worried. Since the Institute had dared to take them out for the competition, they surely possess a few methods to protect them from harm. Sure enough, as Steve was about to activate the quantum energy at 120%, a sigh sounded out from the corner of the control cabin. Steve's subordinates instantly quietened their chatter as a middle-aged man stood up from the retractable chair he was sleeping in. "Boy, Steve, no need to waste the energy core of the ship. Open the panoramic." The mid-to-aged man said in a low tone. "Yes, Mr. Smith," Steve replied, and he halted the movement of the cruiser. Pressing a button, a hatch which was a meter wide opened at the top of the control cabin. Suddenly, there was sounds of bones cracking as a muffled groan rang out. It asked for Mr. Smith. He groaned as two large pairs of wings emerged from his back, still dripping with the bodily fluids in his body. The wings were thin and leathery, similar to a bat wings. The wings was almost 2 meters long and was as black as ink, while the joints formed a few pair of hooked claw like sharp bone blades. Thump! With a light stomp of his feet, his body moved forwards like lightning, and the claws of his wings caught onto the edges of the hole as he catapulted forwards through the panoramic on the roof. His movements, untraceable as he disappeared into the air. Upon seeing this, Steve quickly flipped a switch. Suddenly, the sky cruiser walls shimmered, as though a glitch had been discovered, and then, with a schwa sound, the exterior walls of the ship seemed to have turned completely transparent, as those who were inside of it could practically see through the walls, having a view of the outside world. The students' eyes opened wide in surprise. It was a shocking sight to behold. The clouds were practically visible to see, drifting. It wasn't that they weren't aware that such technology existed, and in fact, they had heard about such things. It was the fact that the technology was a very expensive piece of equipment to procure and was rare. They hadn't expected to see one so soon. David was also surprised as he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He could really see the clouds drifting and tumbling through the walls of the ship. While it might have looked like magic, it was in fact just a piece of finely connected cameras, placed in a special matrix around specific points of the sky cruiser until it covered its whole exterior. The gadget would then receive the projected data, which is in a video format, and then projecting them towards the interior in a holographic image which covered the entire interior of the sky cruiser. The whole effect would look as though the walls of the cruiser had turned transparent. But as he was deep in, though, something instantly caught his eyes amidst the clouds. He caught sight of a huge beast almost 3 meters long. The beast had the head of a pigeon, but beak as sharp as a sword. Feathers and wings, just like that of a normal pigeon, but instead of the soft and fluffy feathers of a bird, it was instead a hard, inflexible rows of gray scales that covered its entirety of its body, looking as though it was as hard as steel itself, with its long snake-like tail that lashed around randomly like a mad whip. Its most prominent features were its talons. While a normal bird of prey had about 5 claws and at least 3 claws, this beast had only 2 claws. But the 2 claws was its strongest point, its nail long and very sharp, looking like 2 curved scythes from hell, was its most terrifying weapon. David was dumbfounded, and he doubtfully thought to himself, "Isn't that a pigeon?" He blinked his eyes, but the beast was still the same. A pigeon that had evolved from its previously weak form to a more stronger form. But in the next second, there was a sudden flap of wings, entirely different from the previous set of flaps coming from the 2-clawed mutant pigeon. Shifting their gazes, the students saw a middle-aged man with wings almost 2 meters long appeared before the mutant pigeon in a ghost-like manner. Obviously stunned, the 2-clawed mutant pigeon let out a sudden shriek and flapped at its wing in a panic, trying to move backwards. This was the first time it had experienced someone getting close to it with a speed its eyes couldn't discern. Whoosh! A sound akin to one's flesh being sliced rang out, and a blinding silvery white lights flashed from the middle-aged man's position. His wings flapped rapidly, and his body moved as 2 steel blades seemed to have or appeared out of nowhere onto his hands. His body moved, and no one is able to discern its position. In a split second, his body strangely passed through the 2-clawed mutant pigeon as he reappeared at the flank of the bird. But his posture was weird as his hand which held onto the blades was raised. A few drops of blood could be seen on the face of the swords. Suddenly, the mutant beast's body shivered, and immediately, it burst into several chunks of meat. Blood, guts, and fluids flooded the entire sky. And the body parts. One strike. The man had used just 1 strike to finish off an evolved beast, which was also almost very close to reaching the orange glow, already very close to peaking the red state. It was almost impossible to comprehend, leaving the crowds of students in awe. Seeing as the beast was dead, the ship continued on its way to the map. David kept thinking about the middle-aged man. He had concluded that it was a powerhouse who had been assigned there to protect them from any unexpected or unforeseen circumstances. Breaking his chain of thoughts, a soft voice rang out to the students 3 hours after the flight. "We would reach the destination soon. Get ready." It wasn't the raspy and cold voice of Captain Steve. It was Aone of the crew members. Hearing her words, the students instantly readied themselves as they circulated their blood and combat techniques while still seated in the seat they had been assigned to. David also circuits his blood, and small amount of slightly visible heat waves could be seen from his body. Meanwhile, Captain Steve replied to his subordinate as he asked, "Are we already situated at the center of the map?" "Not yet, but we will be there in a few minutes. I just confirmed that, sir," she replied while still seated in her chair. Is that so? Release them already. I've wasted enough time with them as it is." She looked upwards at the standing Captain Steve up from her seat, and she replied worriedly, "Will that be okay? Won't that just be unfair to some of them due to the distance?" Waving his hands dismissively, he replied, "We are almost there anyway. A few kilometers won't matter. Make the drop." Steve replied as his tone grew sinister as his expression was expectant. The other crew members shook their heads in pity for what the students were about to experience. The lady hesitated, but she steeled herself. It was a command from Captain himself anyways. If somehow they got into trouble, she would just place all the blame on him. Simple. After going through that thought, she leaned to her left, few meters away from the control center. There, a red lever was hanging slanty, almost against the ground. Touching the lever, she swiftly pulled the lever upwards with her strength. Bam! The red lever locked in place, and a series of events took place soon after. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Suddenly, David's heart palpitated, His body became slack and his eyes drooped. He immediately knew things were going bad. Propelling his blood fiercely, his muscles bulged and his veins popped out. He grabbed a hold of his seat and held onto it tightly. But if one observed the entirety of the students, one would see that David wasn't the only person who had done this. Several other students had also taken precautions. In a split second, the resonating sounds of a siren reverberated through the entire ship, and an automated voice suddenly rang out. "Get ready for the drop. Be prepared." The clueless youths glanced at each other, puzzled as to what was going on. Abruptly, they instantly felt the floor beneath their seats gave out, and below their feet was actually just empty air and clouds. Everyone's mind turned blank in that instant, as though they had rehearsed it previously. Even though some had been warned, their informant actually hadn't told them of the situation which would occur. David blinked his eyes, but before he could blink them again, he plummeted down from the sky with increasing speed. Screams of horror rang out as almost all the 200-plus students in the plane shouted out in fear. But the screams were instantly drowned by the sounds of air rushing past them. David felt his heart dropped, and it actually skipped a beat, which signified how bewildered he was. He knew something was about to happen, but he hadn't expected this to happen, which reminded him of the instructions he had read. He had been suspicious and was doubtful when he saw the sentence "before you drop." He knew something was wrong with the sentence, but who would have expected it to be true? They were literally dropped from the sky. Is the Institute's method usually this absurd, or is it that the captain had actually gone insane? Numerous speculations popped out from the students' thoughts as they descended towards the ground. David held on tightly to the seat, securing his body to the seat, and he leaned back, while his body fell, rotating headfirst towards the rapidly advancing Earth. He closed his eyes tightly as his brain rapidly churned. He was thinking about how they were going to survive this disaster, but soon after, he frowned. The pain-inducing headache was here again, but he had concluded that the Institute wouldn't just put all 800-plus students to their deaths. They must have a few means to keep them alive. Upon coming to this conclusion, David sat back nonchalantly, and he indifferently glanced at the other falling students whose body were also spinning while they were busy shouting in alarm and flaying their hand all over the place in panic. His sight also noticed Phillida, who closed her eyes tightly shut. Her beautiful lashes trembled incessantly, holding securely her little black box against her chest. Retracting his gaze, he casually closed his eyes and relaxed, taking in the freshness of and although it was a little difficult to breathe, the atmosphere oppressed was a little too much, but to the students, breathing in that situation was still an easy feat for them. As though answering to David's thoughts, a few sounds of machinery rang out, and David felt the heavy chair he was still sitting on vibrate in a weird manner. Rearranging its components, the seat swiftly formed two Omni mini-turbo thrusters looking exactly like an aircraft wings by both sides, and it immediately activated as two fiery streams of combustible energy blasted out in an overwhelming manner. When the turbo engine ignited, David felt his entire being rumbled as though he had been forcibly jacked upwards with incredible speed when his original displacement was actually downwards. If it weren't for the fact that he had been circulating his blood around his system, he would definitely be slightly injured by the resultant force. The solid turbo thrusters blasted off, giving him a massive kick in the back as the engine swirled with flexibility to maintain a stable position. The pounding exhaust from the twin boosters shook David continuously as he accelerated, ripping through the upper atmosphere under massive pounds of explosive force. David wasn't the only one to experience such things. The rest of the 200 to 300 students also had the same experience as their thrusters began to ignite like fireflies in the sky, stabilizing their downward momentum. David was about to wipe off cold sweat on his forehead after he had stabilized, currently floating on the air, when he suddenly heard his AI say, "Emergency air pod had been activated." Suddenly, a screen popped up from the armrest of the seat. It was the map that had been handed to him by the Institute. It marked the current position he was currently in, which was right at the center of the large map with his face on it. Then it also showed the location David had previously marked as his drop position. Afterwards, the system had connected both of the dots in a straight line and also showed the distance at which he would need to get to his drop zone. In the next second, the AI spoke again. Initialization completed. Determining the drop location of the host. Location determined. Time taken to get to the drop zone, 25 minutes and 14 seconds. Ready for the takeoff. Please be prepared. David didn't have the chance to digest, to assimilate its meaning when all of a sudden, the turbo thrusters that had been maintaining his stable self in the air stirred slightly to the sides, and then the turbo output increased exponentially as his figure was being blasted off towards a certain direction with astonishing speed, almost marching the terrifying speed of Mach 11. Surprised, David immediately spoke up. "Wait, hold up. I apologize, David, but this is a command instilled by the Institute which directly overrides your authority level. You cannot stop its movement now, unless it drops down at its location." His AI replied in its usual robotic female voice, but it held an apologetic tone within. David frowned upon hearing this, and he reprehended. Not able to control the movements of the emergency AirPod simply means the students would be unable to make any alterations to the location they had chosen to drop at. David was slightly disappointed, but he had already made his decision. He wouldn't change it. His pod accelerated with full speed, and David had the luxury to view the situations of other students. He relaxed a little when he saw their situation was slightly similar to his. And he wasn't at all surprised when he saw a little more than 100 emergency pods moving along the location he had selected, since it was one of the low-level safe zones available in the entire map. The region was actually a very large and prosperous city called the Sunset City a few decades ago. It had been a stronghold in itself, as the mayor of the city was a very strong powerhouse. He had repeatedly resisted the assault of various strong beasts in his city and had protected its citizens from those vile, evolved monsters. At that time, he never collected a single din from the citizens. His only condition was for his people to keep the city clean, and the citizens should make amendments to the city once there was any shortcomings in the surrounding area. It was quite the favorable condition for everybody, so why not? The citizens of the city worshipped him like a god and had accepted him as an overlord. Several statuses had been placed on various popular sites in the city for both the foreigners from other strongholds and the citizens from their city to admire. It was a nice place to raise a family at such a peaceful location. That was why the foreigners from other strongholds would choose to settle in, deciding to never leave. But this drew in jealousy and envy from other strongholds. Under the span of a single night, the city had been put to ruins as the rapidly evolved beings terrorized the city without leaving out a single child alive. Unfortunately, the mayor wasn't available to resist the waves of beast for the people. He had been invited to a banquet by other mayors. They could only cry out in terror and fear as they were being killed. Mach 1 times the speed of sound, Mach 2 times. A few minutes later, the blurry Earth's surface began to clear up, and David could see the ruins the city had been transformed into. It was the smell which engulfed him at first, and he almost felt like puking. It was a wretched smell of decayed blood and broken buildings. From the air above, David couldn't see the whole map, but from his point of view, all he could perceive was trees, vines, and a few weather-worn and destroyed buildings surrounded by massive amount of grasses and weeds. The roof of the buildings he could see had caved in, weighed down by vines and other unknown foliage. After about 20 minutes, the turbo thrusters suddenly rumbled as it changed its general direction, which he and other students had been moving towards. Previously, they were like a flock of birds, flying towards a certain direction, but David's pod change of direction could clearly be seen by most of the students. As if that was a green light, a few other students' pod began to separate from the park, and they flew in nightly different directions. Although the safe zone was safe and all, it wasn't in David's character to stay in hiding. Notwithstanding, the safe zones had several basic amenities, equipments, and was a low-tier loot zone. They were severely limited. If he landed on the safe zone, he would need to fight for resources with the other students. David frowned at the thought. Fighting was fine by him, but battling like a maniac with his peers for a low-level equipment was just stupid to him. There were several high loot zones in the map. He wouldn't waste his time battling for a low-level gadget when there was a mid-level or high-level gadget sitting around the corner. After 3 minutes, David scanned his surrounding sky around him and saw that there's 7 figures zooming in the same direction as he was, directly behind him. His eyebrow rose when he saw this. Scrutinizing their faces, David couldn't recognize any of them, but he was sure that they were all male students. After his scrutiny, his eyes turned indifferent as he instantly retreated gaze. He had seemingly lost interest in them entirely. As he was getting closer to the wet and muddy floor, David's eyes lit up in joy as he saw what was on the ground. Around the area, he had calculated he would drop. I knew I was right in my decision. David smiled. It seems as though luck was on his side. The low-level gadgets was directly a few meters away from his drop location. Although he couldn't determine the amounts of the gadgets on the ground, it didn't matter to David. He was going to take the all. If it was only 1, then fine. If it was 2, he was going to take 2. If it was 3, he would still take the whole 3, and if it was 10 that was there was no need to think. B would take the whole thing, not leaving a single thing for anyone. He smirked at his good luck. Suddenly, he heard a few voices laughing out. Haha, my luck is unexpectedly so good today. A gadget on my drop site, what luck? Someone let out a peal of laughter as it reverberated through the air. It was obvious Bronx had focused his blood circulation in his lungs and had hardened the muscles significantly, momentarily granting him the ability to shout as loud as he wished. Someone immediately let out a cold snort that resonated like thunder in sky, and they said with a chilling tone, "If anyone dares to touch my things, they are asking to die." Icarus said in a threatening tone, his tone not a single pitch lower than Bronx's. "I think you guys should all calm down. We can settle the matter more amicably, but first, we need a touchdown, after which we could discuss things." Xavier said as he tried to pacify things, and it seemed to work as no one else said anything. David gave them a sidelong glance, and he didn't mind them anymore. He was ahead of them, and it was apparent that he would be the first to get there. What was surprising was that neither did Xavier, Bronx, Icarus, nor the other 4 people said anything about him. It was as if they had intentionally disregarded him, almost as though he wasn't worth their time nor concern. David didn't mind it, though. He actually liked the fact that they had neglected him. It was to his advantage, so why would he attempt to stop them? His smile grew a notch wider. Suddenly, the turbo thruster's output slowed down considerably as its altitude began to decrease. Also, the few dead trees in the surroundings. Just 10 meters away to touchdown, the voice of his AI spoke again. Destination reached. Activating self-eject code. Self-eject code activated. Please be prepared. This time, David had learned from his mistakes. He didn't bother himself pondering the words his AI had spouted. He immediately circulated his blood, strengthening every part of his body. There was a sudden rumble, and David felt like someone had given him a solid kick in his butt. The force was powerful as his figure immediately catapulted to the ground. If it weren't for the fact that he had been prepared, the experience would be quite painful for him. Still in the air, David calmly twisted his body as he used the momentum to land gracefully on udge ground, but a few mud and dirt splashed in his black trousers, staining them to ash. David almost shouted out in fury. It was his favorite pant because it had lots of pockets in them, which he had counted, and it was about 25 and counting. 10 on the left leg, then on the right leg, with 5 hidden on the interior part of the pants. Although he was slightly frustrated about the matter, he swiftly threw that to the back of his mind as he remembered there was something important of his he had to get. The students were still a few meters away from David's position, and 2 unexpectedly self-ejected like that, while the other 5 emergency pod passed over David's head. Although they ought to have dropped together with David, they didn't select the exact spot David had chosen as his drop spot. But the position wasn't exactly far off from David's location. David moved swiftly towards the direction in which the gadgets were located. Upon reaching there, David immediately pulled the box lid open, but he failed. It was as thought it had been locked tightly. What nonsense is this? If you want to give us something, why put a lock on it? David grumbled to himself, but while he was doing that, he immediately took his left and placed it on top of the box. Shwa! David felt a type of vibration on his arm as it was being scanned by the box. A few seconds later, the The box let out a peal of air and with the sound of a treasure box being opened. David gleefully opened up the box. He saw two pieces of equipment within. As he was about to stretch out his hands to take them, he suddenly felt the wind behind him stir slightly and earth vibrating softly. His eyes flashed, and without looking back, he revolved his blood slyly, and he sent a fist hurling backwards. The fist was swift, fast and silent, but was in fact more fierce and deadly. As if he had eyes, had the back. Bang! His fist instantly connected with another person's fist with a bang that had been silently approaching his back. If it weren't for the fact that the wind was disturbed, someone else might not be aware of such attack until it was too late. David's body trembled slightly, and that was all. But his attackers couldn't help taking a few steps backwards, but he used the momentum to retreat speedily, and he had outright used an ambush and combat technique, but David was able to counter it with an ordinary fist, no technique involved. He knew he had met an extremely troublesome opponent this time. That person was unexpectedly Xavier, the one that had acted like a gentleman previously and had tried to mediate between them. He had unexpectedly been the first person amongst the 7 people to have gotten there. David removed his stretched hands from the box to see the person disturbing him from his moments. "Do you need something from me?" David asked puzzledly as he glanced at the handsome youth. He looked like a normal gentleman, and David wouldn't expect that he was the type to sneak an attack on him. Well, at this point in time, David wouldn't judge a book by its cover anymore, nor would he call a spade a spade. No student in the Institute was really that kind-hearted, even he could feel himself changing. But it was a change he liked. David swiped his hands gently on the box. Instantly, its component disassembled, and after which it reassembled back. But this time it formed a very light compartment backpack. Raising his eyebrows in surprise, David lifted the backpack and placed it onto his back. The backpack instantly got a few notches flatter on his back. It was as though there was nothing in his back to begin with. It was very sleek and dark in color, as it merged from its previous color to a darker shade of black, making it the same as David's shirt color. If one saw it, one might just think it was a vest of some kind. Xavier's eyes flashed with a hint of greed within them when he saw this scene. This was an unexpected surprise. It seems that every loot zone was with a corresponding compartment park, which means that in this zone, although the backpack was only a low-level gadget, it was still a gadget anyways, and it has its own uses. Noon would complain of having too much gadgets in hand. David smiled. He didn't feel any sign of weight on his back. This was an unexpected gain. So instead of 2 gadgets, there was 3 within. If he were to go to the high loot zones, he wondered how the backpacks in there would be like. "Do you plan on keeping that to yourself?" Xavier asked, directly ignoring David's question. David indifferently glanced at him, and he asked, "And do you plan on stopping me?" David revolved his blood, and the pressure around him began to increase. Killing intent flashed in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he had killed anyway. The feeling of killing a human shouldn't be any different than the feeling he had gotten when he had killed the rat in his room back on Earth. Xavier's expression changed when he felt the pressure. It wasn't literally a pressure in the atmosphere. It was a kind of special wave created by the brain and emitted from the body only which another body could, or living organisms with brain and a body could feel. He could guess David might want to silence him before the others came, but he wasn't the least bit afraid. If someone could kill him as they wished, he wouldn't be here standing a lie at this moment. His confidence returned, and his will to do battle rose, and he smiled weirdly. "I'm really not one to fight, but you can't just hoard the equipments all to yourself. You have to learn to share." David snorted, "As though it was your grandfather that kept it there. Why would I have to share with you?" The disdain in his tone apparent. But in the next instant, the pressure he had been emitting receded back, and his expression softened into that of innocence. Astonished, Xavier casted a confused glance at David. He didn't know what just happened, but soon he found out as the yellow bushes and tress behind him shook. A figure bursted out from the tress and shrubs with savage expressions on his face. "Don't you dare touch when I have set my eyes on Bronx." Icarus' voice resounded from behind, but it was apparent that he asked still far behind. Bronx didn't even bother answering to them. He swiftly moved into the location that I had marked, expecting to see the equipments in place, but he was instantly disappointed. His eyes widened as he scanned the surroundings. He saw both David and Xavier standing in different directions. David had an innocent look on his face, but Xavier was emitting waves of one who was ready to strike. He didn't think too deeply into the matter. He took a large stride in Xavier's direction as he asked in a threatening tone. He was in no mood for any impractical nonsense. He had to get the gadget no matter what, and from there, he would advance to other loot zones. That way, he could get a few head start above everyone else. Winning the competition would become a lot easier for him. Xavier frowned at the unexpected accusation. Then he finally understood why David had retracted his back waves and had an innocent look on his face. It was a sinister plot to frame him. But he soon relaxed. If it were that easy to frame him, he also would be here. He immediately responded, "What makes you think the gadget is in my possession? That guy had it with him." Bronk's eyes hardened as he shouted in a low voice, "So you take me for a fool? If you refuse to drop the gadget, I just have to forcefully collect it from you." He immediately made his move, but before he could move, Xavier hurriedly shouted, "If I had it on me, why would I still be here?" he said anxiously. Bronk stopped in his tracks. He knew that Xavier was a trickster, but if Xavier had truly gotten hold of the gadget, he would definitely have been long gone, as he wouldn't have waited to trick him. He turned his head as he looked doubtfully at the weak-looking guy who seems to be still wet behind the ears. Even if the guy had taken it, Xavier would undoubtedly steal it from him. Then he turned angrily at Xavier. "If you weren't the one who has the gadget, who else has it?" Scrunching up his face at the accusation, Xavier said, "I know he looks weak, but don't underestimate him. He took my combat technique without using one to counter it." The seriousness was apparent in his tone. Bronx paused slightly, and the way he looked at David changed. As he was about to question David, Icarus suddenly ran out from the trees with blinding speed. His blood was boiling as he was still circulating his blood in the system. Power filled his body, ready to explode anytime soon. When he saw there wasn't anything left in the ground, he glared towards the two people there with him, directly neglecting David's presence. "Who dares touch my things?" His voice was deep and was laced with a murderous tone, speaking towards Xavier and Bronx. It was apparent he was ready to kill for the gadget and would strike anytime soon. Bronx only pointed at David and said only one word. "Him." Icarus frowned as he looked towards David. David's eyes glinted as he instantly put up a fearful expression. Me? I just got here before him." He pointed at Xavier and he continued, "There was also nothing here when I saw him." Bronx and Icarus were suddenly confused who actually had the gadgets with them. An evil light flashed in Icarus' eyes as he laughed coldly. "They will naturally confess after we capture them. I will take on the dude over there. You handle Xavier." Without waiting for Bronx to agree to his suggestion, he instantly made his move. Bronx's eyes flashed with realization as he felt it wasn't really a bad idea. Since they couldn't differentiate who was lying and who was speaking the truth, they just need to capture them and search their bodies. Very simple. Having thought of this, Bionx also made his move. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A few meters away, on a large tree, several figures could be seen standing on a tree branch leisurely as they quietly watched the battle that was about to unfold. "Shouldn't we join the fight for the gadgets?" someone asked casually. We should, but we will just have to wait since we don't actually know who truly had the gadget." The second youth interrupted. "Let them exhaust each other. That's the moment we need to strike. Not like they would be able to take us on anyway. We also need to silence them. The lesser the people who know about the gadget, better." The third said, "Why killing intent? I think we should retreat. I don't feel too good about this." The fourth suddenly spoke up. The second immediately snorted as he said with disdain, "You don't feel too good about anything. How is this one any different? As long as they aren't in the top 500 in the rankings list, they should be easy to deal with." Not minding him anymore, they turned to face the battle that was about to start. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Crazy Bee asterisk starred. David muttered to himself. He had wanted to play with them for a bit before taking his leave, but who would have expected it would be ruined so quickly? Whoosh! He stepped backwards slightly as he avoided a punch heading to his temple with terrifying force. The punch wasn't as silent as Xavier's, but the force behind the punch was much more deadly. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. David kept on swaying his body like a leaf, moving his body both left and right. He kept dodging the barrage of attacks sent his way. No matter which moves he made, David evaded them by a hairbreadth every single time. Bronx suddenly backed away with his expression rather ugly. Where are you ranked among the top 500 students? Bronx tried to find out about David. His body looked quite weak, but his thighs looked incredibly sturdy, as if they could stomp the earth down itself. Does it matter? David questioned, after which he said to the people in the forest with him, I will be leaving now, fellow students. Please don't mind me. The ground under his feet exploded. Several clumps of mud flew about, and his figure flashed as he disappeared from his previous position, disappearing into the forest. Instantly, numerous voices shouted out in fury. You dare? Stop right there. Don't allow him to leave. Stop him. Since David had retreated first, it was obvious that the gadgets was in his possession. They obviously wouldn't allow David to go as he pleased. A few minutes later, when David was sure he had lost them, he stopped in his tracks as he rested on a slightly yellow tree branch. It was obvious that the radiation in the atmosphere had affected its color. Come out, David said, but if one were to observe the surroundings, they would realize that there was no one in his immediately surroundings, as it was empty. A minute passed, but still, the area was as empty as it was the first place. David's eyes flashed with a cold glint as he asked, Will you come out, or should I force you out myself? The threat was apparent in his tone. He hated those who snuck around, attacking in the dark. Suddenly, a few large trees at some distance away from him trembled, and 3 figures swiftly jumped out from the tall tree, landing on the ground with a few thuds. David scanned the 3 male figures with his eyes, his face expressionless as he asked, Is there a reason as to why you guys decided to tail me? A slim but fit male youth who appeared to be the leader sneered. It seems you were in a hurry to leave, since you forgot to drop our belonging before you left. David's face remained expressionless. Alas, he asked, What are you ranked among the top 500 students? He wanted to confirm a speculation he had on his mind. Unfortunately, I'm ranked 374th. Rex stated proudly with a hint of disdain in his tone. Amongst the new students, those who are ranked 500 plus are true genius, with most of them having 3-star talent, while most of them are stuck in their heart locks, unable to advance in their blood revolution. These people had gained a massive amount of experience fighting each other. Since they couldn't advance to the next blood revolution by practicing, they spent the remainder of their time battling each other every day. Their techniques had mostly reached the 2nd level, added with other advantages. To them, crushing other students who had reached 50 cycle per minute was as easy as starting an automaton. 374 on. This ranking was much lower than David had expected. Rex remained still. He was also trying to gauge David's strength. If it were on a normal circumstance, he would have undoubtedly attacked without wasting his time. But he was a bit weary of David, because he and his group had to utilize their motion techniques to catch up to his speed, even though they hadn't gone all out in their endeavors. It was still slightly surprising to Rex. Make your move. David didn't bother to change his stance, nor did he immediately circulate his blood. Had he done so, even if he didn't use his full strength, his opponents would all fall in a few strikes. At the same time, he wished to know the combat ability of a top 500 student would be. Fascinating, be careful. Signaling his hands to his teammates that he would attack alone, Rex's figure flashed. His legs moved like spiders as he trotted forward, sending a spinning kick towards David's direction. Mid-tier black class kick style. Spinning spear kick him technique. David let out a grin as he also let out a storm-like kick that spun like a whirlwind. Low-tier black class kick style cyclonic kick. He had purchased this technique a while ago from the archive for an expensive amount of gyno points. Bang, bang, bang. In just a few breaths, the two of them let out kicking attacks that like bullets. Within the radius of a few meters, sounds of explosions could be heard, and the sound of their blood revolutions that sounded as fast as a piston in a cylinder and as loud as thunder. Rex's blood circulation was at 57 cycles per minute, almost reaching the 60 cycles per minute benchmark. Once one had passed through the 60 CPM milestone, which was equivalent to 1 cycle per second, one could decide if they wanted to advance to the next stage or continue to increase and improve the blood circulation. His exercising technique, the stress variance technique, was almost reaching the second level, only needing a bit of final push, and his kicking technique, which was at the second state, almost reaching the third state. From a spectator's point of view, he should have the upper hand in all aspects and should have overwhelmed David. According to the sounds of their hearts beating, although an ordinary person wouldn't be able to make count of the beats considering how fast their hearts are beating, but the students watching could do so. And from their observations, David's blood cycles was definitely slower than Rex's, but David could still take on Rex's kicking technique without any problems. It made the two who had been watching confused as to what was happening, who knew David had long passed the limit of 1 blood revolution per second. His exercising technique had long since surpassed the second state, which was even a low-tier, red-class motion technique. He was only using Rex to brush up his fighting style and experience. Even though the combat technique, cyclonic kick, was only a low-tier, black grade, and was even 2 tiers lower than the spinning spear kick art, he had since reached the perfection state of the kick technique long ago, and that was due to the ability he had gained after he reincarnated. The ability to control his body freely as he pleased. A combat technique requires extreme control, likewise an exercising technique. But there was no body like David who could perfectly control his muscles, bones, and body at such level. That was why others would practice the technique repeatedly until they reached the glimpse state. And with even more practice, they would advance to the next state, and when their bodies had gotten used to the movement and control, they could finally advance to the perfection state. But David only needed to practice the technique a few times just to remember them, and then he would easily reach the perfection state with groundbreaking speed. He had perfected cyclone kick, and apart from that, his physical strength was at a very terrifying state. Even though he limited his blood circulation, his body sturdiness wouldn't lie. He can't possibly waste his concentration to lower his muscles' density just because of this. And most especially, he didn't think of that. Not only did all this compensate for the difference in blood revolution, this combat ability had overall exceeded Rex's. As expected, he really had a truck up his sleeves. Rex's expression turned grave. Before he attacked, he had only taken David a little serious due to his speed and felt like he could easily defeat him with his current ability. But now that mentality had changed. What body refinement technique did you practice? Rex questioned. He too practiced a body refinement technique, but it was just the common bronze vest technique which one could acquire for free if one tried really hard. Although it was a very effective technique that helps refine the body, it requires a very painful process, and the time needed to touch upon the glimpse state was even higher than most high-tier black grade technique. It wasn't really worth it to practice such hard and painful technique. Because of its extremely high difficulty, he didn't intend to spend too much time and resources to practice cultivation techniques. Does it matter? David queried. Not that he wanted to conceal anything, he just hadn't practiced any. But if he revealed that, Rex might just get suspicious, which might end his training a little earlier than he had accounted for. Rex's expression turned a bit black as he thought. Then with a glint in his eyes, he said, "Let us fight on the trees." Rex stomped forcefully on the ground, and his body catapulted upwards like a huge bird. On land, there wasn't any guarantee that he could beat David quickly, but on the trees, and with his motion technique, he thought that he had a higher possibility of beating him quicker. He hadn't thought that he would resort to such tactics, but desperate times call for desperate measures. David's first thoughts was to instantly refuse. What a joke. He was too lazy to fight Bronx, and the others as he thought it was a hassle, and now this guy was saying they should take their fight to the trees? His thoughts were he'll know. He had forced himself to waste his time already. He didn't want to fight anymore, but then again, if he didn't, it would seem as though all his effort to gain a bit of experience would all be in vain. What? Are you afraid I'm going to beat you? Rex mocked with a sneer coldly plastered on his face. With a darkened expression, David replied reluctantly, "You asked for it." He stomped his feet forcefully and the muscles in his legs seemed to vibrate like a wave and twist like a cyclone as it advanced towards the huge tree. Rex's mouth twitched as he saw that. He had reached the perfection state. No wonder he dared come up here. He had actually reached the perfection state. The perfection state doesn't just come with a major boost in strength or technique. It comes with the ability to freely control or utilize the technique as one wished or when one felt like it. For example, in David's situation, the cyclonic kick was only meant for attacking and attacking alone. But in the perfection state, one could utilize the technique for anything, just like David did. He changed an attack technique to a motion technique. He had activated it to lift himself up from the ground and had controlled its strength to land in the exact position as he had wished. Even when he moved slightly, he unconsciously used it as he pranced within the trees. This was what the perfection state grants, the ability to freely control the output of strength the technique gives. Tap, tap, tap. The two were like monkeys as they moved almost effortlessly on the trees. Meanwhile, David was still astonished about how the trees and the surroundings seems to be bigger than an entire house, and the shortest amongst them seemed to be 20 meters in height. This is where the sounds are coming from, someone said as various groups of students popped out from within the bushes. The location of their fight wasn't that far from the safe zone. The students there had been hearing the sounds of explosions, so they had gathered to check it out. Rex Fatrum, he is among the 9 Rex's experts. That's right, Rex is ranked second among the 9 expert. He has a lot of fighting experience. Who is his opponent, though? I haven't seen him before. The person sounded really confused. I think I know who he is. His name is David. He was quite lucky and had ranked in the 7th position of the rankings during the unexpected ranking release. That powerful? No, you're mistaken. He had been only lucky to have measures his strength earlier than the others. I thought he would be able to have been once ranked in the rankings. It was said that he almost died on the 4th day, but he was pretty lucky to have survived. What is his rankings now? From the strength he displays, he should be at most in the 400th place in the rankings. Terra firma crush. Rex abruptly stomped his foot forcefully on the tree. The tree trembled as massive amount of leaves clouded the entire space. And under the cover of the leaf cloud, Rex sent a flying kick piercing at David. The kick was sharp and ferocious unlike the previous ones. This was more dangerous and harder to deal with. Rex sure is smart, obscuring his enemy's line of sight before striking out a trump card. A short and bulky-looking young man said with a smile. Someone then added, "You can only blame David's stupidity who actually thought to fight square and fair." They all acknowledged David's ability since he had once held the 7th place for a while, but he seemed to be a little too innocent. Storming purse. David's body suddenly turned hazy as though the world had turned blur. On the tree, there seemed to be a condensed spear that seemed to pierce through the barrage of falling leaves in the air, piercing through every corner of the space David was occupying like a beehive. Spinning wind. David's body spun rapidly like a revolving top. On the tree, there seemed to be a tornado up on the tree as David's body spun rapidly. Rex's attacks couldn't even touch the edge of David's clothes. Spinning wind was the final style in cyclonic kicking technique. It placed emphasis on the body's form, adaptability, and control. It was the core essence to practicing the technique. And after practicing it to the perfection state, one's speed would be like the cyclone. Fast but also deadly, soft but also tough, formless but tangible. Swoosh, swoosh. The trees vibrated and swayed with force as David's body kept spinning around Rex, flashing like the winds. He was moving at such a high velocity, his body seemed to be everywhere at once, and with the yellow leaves that were occasionally dropping obscured his location more. Without any warning, David appeared behind Rex like the wind. He sent a palm attack towards his back utilizing the Scorching Fury. He had practiced both Scorching Fury and Cyclone Kick to perfection. His attacks can be as fierce and as fast as he wants without any intervals. His palm turned a bit red as it was about to connect. Suddenly, at the crucial moment, Rex swiftly turned back as he locked David's hand in an iron grip. With a light bang, The surrounding leaves was instantly cleared away, revealing the two-figure. Rex was violently shaken as he knocked down wards by the force, breaking 4 branches in the process before regaining his footing in the 5th, but it was clear the branch was also about to break due to the force. Whilst David skidded backwards 5 steps, a slight suction force could be heard in the background. And just when Rex thought he had broken free, David sucked in a few sturdy leaves with his palms, utilizing the cyclonic technique, and without waiting for Rex to find his footing, he shot them out with extreme speed. It as at this moment Rex had no other choice but to use his trump card. A blue transparent veil instantly enveloped Rex, and it shimmered with a resplendent glow. Pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa. The leaves were no different from ordinary bullets as they struck against the blue transparent veil, shielding Rex. But they were immediately repelled beyond the magnetic force field. It was a low-level defensive gadget in TE Shield series. It had been produced by condensing and compressing insane amounts of magnetic force into a small-sized part and using the theory of magnetics energy. Alike poles repel and like poles attract. Like, for example, there are 2 pipes in a magnetic field, the North Pole and South Pole. If different poles like the South Pole and the North Pole meet, they would attract each other. If the same poles meet each other, such as the South Pole and another South Pole or North Moke and another North Pole, they would repel one and the other. The force field series were basically based on such logic. 2 like poles have been compressed to contain massive amounts of magnetic field and have been tightly secured next to each other inside a device, which upon activation, electric currents would be directed, which would activate its magnetic field, forming a barrier that wouldn't let anything pass through it. It can only be broken if there was a strong kinetic force stronger than the flux energy in the device to forcefully break the protective barrier. I have to admit, your combat ability is more greater than I had expected, but Rex wouldn't allow myself to be defeated. Propelling his figure upwards, he jumped onto the branch David was situated on. Rex dashed towards David with a forceful pierce of his leg. The piercing leg was silent, but it still accompanied a long bit soft whistling sound. It tore apart under his skill as he sent it towards David's direction. It gave the appeal as though it was unblockable. David wasn't complacent at all. Since he had decided to limit his blood circulation, he was going to see through it to the end. But that didn't make him careless at all. Form. He instantly rotated his arms, forcefully forming a sort of yin-yang pose. This was another move from the cyclone kicking technique. His hands drew a semicircle in midair, and the air vibrated with force. The semicircle seemed to form a blurry color of white and black, but it was impossible to witness clearly which is it. The decayed leaves that were flying about seemed to be pulled towards the semicircle. It was like the eye of a tornado. Likewise was Rex's powerful piercing attack. It was forcefully pulled in the middle of his hands, just like a magnet. All of a sudden, he seemed to have grasped hold of Rex's leg, using your opponent's momentum against them to gain more kinetic energy. Not good. Rex's expression changed drastically. Not good. Rex's expression changed drastically. The blur, which seemed to contain the color of black and blue, seemed to envelope his vision, making him unable to see where his attack was coming to hit. His only option was to retreat without hesitation, because he knew if that pale technique was to get hold of, he would be done for. Eldest sister, it seemed we all have underestimated him, and I apologize for doubting your judgment previously. Evans extenuated. Phillida's eyes flashed as she watched the battle that was ongoing. It seemed she too had underestimated him a little, then her eyes changed into one of indifference. Although his combat abilities had exceeded her expectations, he was still too weak to resist her. After she had used the Butterfly's Effect serum to assist her break the heartlock and help her improve on her exercising technique, her strength had grown by leaps and bounds, and her blood revolution had passed the 60 cycle per minute benchmark. So, she would obviously not take David seriously in her eyes. After watching them fight, she had complete confidence in defeating David. But is it true he tried to learn a red-grade combat technique? Evans asked. Phillida maintained her expressionless face as she nodded in acknowledgement. If that is so, Isn't he just plain stupid? Or does he think he had the talent to succeed in practicing a red grade manual? He is simply too naive. Another person spoke up. If one had paid to acquire information on David from the Institute, they would see that he had a red grade technique listed among the list of techniques he had practiced. But what the Institute won't state is that they absolutely wouldn't reveal if said had succeeded in practicing the technique or not. In fact, David wasn't the only one to have made such a mistake. There were several other students who had unknowingly chosen a combat technique they were unable to practice. That was why the Institute was unconcerned about it or not. They would have fully investigated the matter. What do you think you were going to? David stomped his foot, and the branch beneath his feet jet out a deafening cry. His hands instantly latched onto Rex's leg, and with a twist of his waist, bang, 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 he lifted Rex's body with pure strength as he smashed him down repeatedly on the tree branches. The tree shook violently, and Rex could only guide his head in fear. The expressions of Rex's teammates changed as they yelled with anger. "Release him! You dare!" Seeing as the two figures were rapidly approaching his location, he swung Rex's body in a circle as he built up potential energy, and with full force, he swung Rex's body to their direction. He was already done with his experiments and had enough fight to roughly gauge his strength. There was no point in remaining here any long. With a stomp, the tree shook and David instantly flew towards the dense trees, vanishing from everyone's sight. Rex lost? This is unimaginable. This David guy seemed strong. At the very least, he could rank top 200 in the rankings. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When he had gotten further away from the crowd into a secluded place, David glanced around carefully as he stood still. The reason he had fled so hurriedly wasn't about the fact that he was afraid of Rex and his teammates. It was because if they were to let out the fact that he has a gadget with him, he would truly be done for. Although he was a 50% sure they would keep the secret to themselves in order to acquire it from him without having to face the crowds. He still couldn't bet in the remaining 50. After a few minutes, he was finally certain that he was alone. Detaching the compart backpack, he hurriedly opened up the pack. There were 2 items in there, a microchip and a very thin vest that was as light as a feather. Furrowing his brows, the chip was as small as his fingernails, and he twirled it with his fingers. After a few minutes of scrutiny, David felt a headache coming. He was unable to figure out the exact usage of the microchip. As if sensing his misery, his AI suddenly spoke up. Detecting an ability microchip, should system proceed in processing and extracting the data installed in it. Stunned, David let out a grin as he replied. Sure. Please do. Extracting data now. Extraction completed. Name of data that was extracted, low-grade life form detection module. Scan for any life forms within the perimeter of a 100-meter radius. Can only be utilized 3 times a day, and it lasts for the duration of 30 seconds. David's side grin turned into an ugly expression. It was no different than being useless then. Lasts for 30 seconds, and can only be used 3 times a day, for only a radius of 100 meters? How is that any different from not having anything in the first place? David grumbled to himself in displeasure. He had already marked the ability useless. But first, he needed to test the ability. Opening up his interface, he clicked on the ability menu, and he saw the description of the ability in his interface. David wasn't in a hurry to activate it as of yet. Firstly, he created a shortcut to use the ability whenever he wished. He inserted that only if he tapped on his imprint 3 times in a second would the ability activate. Closing his holographic image, he tested the shortcut he had created. Okay, let's do this. Tapping his imprint 3 times, it was as though reality flickered for moments, and then a few red dots filled his vision, enveloping his eyes. If he looked away from the direction of the red dot, a small arrowhead would indicate the presence of a life form at the edge of his vision. But if he were to stare directly at the dots on his vision, they seemed to widen the closer he got, and then get smaller the farthest he was from the life form. Fascinating. This piqued David's interest. But there was something important he needed to do first. A large red dot was blinking right in front of him. A red arrowhead was projected right at the top edge of his vision. Astonished, David raised his head upwards to inspect where the life signal was coming from. But he saw nothing apart from a heavy shade of trees, keeping the sun rays from piercing through. There was nothing on the trees, but as David tilted his head sideways, the red in his vision remained still at a particular branch of a large tree. David let out a smirk, and he retracted his gaze from its upward stare, casually moving forwards, as though he was a bit to leave his position. His spine suddenly tingled, and David felt his hair stood on end as his body switched to its lazy but optimal posture. Whoosh! Instantaneously, his body swayed, and his figure seemed to want to fade as a yellow blur of something flew past his ears with astonishing speed almost comparable to that of a bullet. If David hadn't performed the technique in that instant, it was unknown what would have happened. David's eyes glinted with a cold light, and he simultaneously sent his arms soaring backwards towards the yellow flying thing that had missed him. "Got you." He caught the yellow blur in midair with his hands. David laughed coldly, looking at the tiny little thing squirming with fear, lying between his hands. It was a little yellow snake-like beast with a flat and streamlined body which allowed it to glide in the air for short periods of time with astonishing speed. In his lectures, David had heard about the snake before, although nothing much, but he still heard bits and pieces of the information. The soaring thread serpent can be a very dangerous beast in the wilderness if one knew nothing about its features and its characteristics. But if one was informed about it in the first place, it would be quite easy to take care of. One of its characteristics was its speed. Its speed was definitely very fast, to a terrifying level, but it can only move in a straight line on the air. And it uses its sharp horn-like tail to pierce through its opponent, just like a bullet would. A new spyer would definitely die if it encountered something like this, but a seasoned spyer whose blood revolution had surpassed 1 cycle per second could easily dispatch a beast of such caliber only if he or she was aware of its information. But an unaware seasoned spyer, it was unknown what would happen, especially when bitten by it. A soaring thread serpent rarely uses its mouth, releasing its toxins, as it contains a very powerful toxin it had accumulated for a few decades, or even centuries. Even a 3 cycles per second spyer would die upon being bitten if not treated within a few days. Its other characteristics was that it flies. One might be thinking, so what if it flies? But that was truly ignorant thinking because it flies backwards. As David was about to get a closer look at the beast in his hands, he felt something was off as he recalled the information about the tread snake. Moreover, his instincts hasn't relaxed yet. In that moment, he suddenly recalled the words, and a single word came to David's mind as he shouted in his head. F***CK. His heart skipped a beat, and his legs' muscles inflated by more than 3 times its previous size. It was as though his leg had been pumped full of air, but the alarming, twisting veins in his legs said otherwise. And as he swiftly stomped his foot to the ground, he hastily made an explosive retreat, and his right hand, which had been holding on to the beast, quickly released its hold. But still, not without activating scorching fury. The temperature in his hands rose like the scorching sun, and his body exploded backwards. Previously, he had used the cyclonic kick art as a motion technique, and since he had reached the perfection state, he could utilize it as he wished. Using it as a motion technique made his movement speed quite fast. But cyclonic kick art was only a low-tier black grade technique. Its speed in the perfection state could never match the speed of the threefold step in its prosaic state or even the glimpse state. He was like a bullet shot out from a machine gun as his body shot backwards. If Rex saw this right now, he would definitely be frozen in shock. The speed David displayed was simply too astonishing. But sadly, that wasn't enough to save him from his current predicament. Although his speed was amazing enough to stun anyone, he wasn't faster than the snake that he had been previously holding. 2 things happened in that scenario. Another characteristic of the soaring thread serpent was that its thinnest part was its tail. No, it was its head. Normally, a snake would definitely have a slight circular shape at the end of one part, and eyes with a mouth born with it, which indicated that it was the head part of its body. But a soaring thread serpent was true at its deception. Its head was cylindrical, the same as its body, but only smaller, which would definitely allow someone to mistake the head for the tail, and its tail had the perfect contour on a snake's body with a sharp horn to boot. With its speed, it was able to pierce its prey with ease, but on the premises that it was unable to do so, and its prey suddenly got a hold of it, it would definitely be surprised to realize that the head which it had caught was just its tail. But that simple second for it to take the prey, to confirm its conjecture, was enough for the serpent to strike a deadly counterattack. First was that he had cleanly and perfectly gotten hold of the little beast, but as he recalled the information regarding the beast, he was fast to make an explosive retreat. But that wasn't enough. The snake's head suddenly rose like an anaconda, its speed surpassing all limits as it immediately, but at David's retracting hand. Bam! 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 David knocked down a few trees down his road with his speed, but that just made him slower as the obstruction stalled him. David's expression changed. He was horrified, but he could only watch with widened eyes as the soaring thread serpent bit at his hand. In that moment, he felt a great force grip his wrist tightly and 7 sharp needles penetrating his hand. A sudden chill was then felt as his hands was starting to go numb almost immediately. His mind suddenly turned blank. He knew he was in trouble this time. He was stronger than the beast. That was a fact he knew, and even the beast was aware of. But what was this helplessness he was feeling? He recalled the information about the thread serpent's poison. The thread serpent could be categorized as a mid-level dark haze beast. The only reason it was even categorized was because of its speed and its poison. Its strength was negligible, to say the least. David could only hope that the thread serpent had accumulated its toxins for just a few years, or if he was lucky, months. He might be able to survive if it was that little. Suddenly, his eyes flashed as he remembered something. If he was going to go down, he wasn't going down this easily. Dying was still a terrifying term to him, which had scarred him. He wasn't going to go through the process one else more. Suddenly, his muscles undulated as his heart constricted. 5-fold strength. Boom! His hands instantly inflated in size, and his veins throbbed in absolute strength. But that wasn't all. Scorching fury. Whoosh! The air twisted and the temperature rose at an astonishing degree. His muscles oscillated as he activated the technique. PSSH. Suddenly, tiny bits of blood sprouted out from his hands like a geyser as the tiny veins in his hands exploded one by one with force. SSSSSSS. The soaring thread serpent swiftly released its grip as the hissing sound of misery escaped its lips. It suddenly dropped to the ground and started twisting its tails as though it was about to die. David finally breathed out a sigh of relief. He had gambled upon this method, but he wasn't sure if it would work. He wasn't sure if only Scorching Fury would work. Hutch was why he added the 3-fold step technique to it. 3-fold step increases one's leg muscles by 3 times, which also simultaneously increases one's speed by 3 times. But the wired thing about this technique was that it also staked an increase in other techniques when used. At first, he wasn't sure of his conjecture when he had previously practiced it, but now it had been confirmed. The chills he had felt also subside as the hidden effects of this exercising method, formless heat, thermodynamics. The power was also amplified, and chilling energy in his body was also converted into heat. First law of thermodynamics. It would always try to convert any form of energy that was intruding its host into its form without reserve. The conversion had been quite slow, but as David activated the 3-fold steps, its power also exploded and the chilling energy in his hands was almost gone now. He quickly deactivated his technique as a fused strong vessel was about to show signs of tearing due to the friction produced by the blood circulation that had forcefully increased with the activation of the 3-fold step technique. He then stared at the dead thread serpent in front of him. A sweet aroma entered his nose, but David was in no mood to enjoy such things. The body had been burnt completely black as though it had been cooked from inside out. Its mouth had even almost turned to ashes, and David wasn't sure if it would disintegrate under his touch. That's the law of heat transfer. Heat can be transmitted through conduction as anything would accept and absorb heat. There are very clear differences between heat and flame. Flame is the visible energy when burning something. Heat is given off a flame and countless other things. Flame produces heat, but heat does not always generate from flame, and heat almost never produces flame. Friction might count. Heat, a form of energy that is transferred by a difference in temperature. Flame, the process of combustion of materials producing heat and light, and often smoke. If you want to think of it a different way, flame is what you see when you look at a fire, and heat is what you feel from the fire. Heat is formless, invisible, and traceless. But you can see flames as it is being transferred from one body to another. While flame is visible and untouchable, you can still see it with your eyes and avoid touching it. You would never touch a pot that is on fire with your bare hands, but you will definitely touch a pot that is on the floor, not knowing it was on the fire a few minutes ago. I almost died. He gazed downwards with a complicated expression. It was still a mystery to him. He was clearly stronger than the damn beast, but he had been deceived into thinking he had the situation under control when it was completely opposite. This forest is more dangerous than I had imagined. He shivered as he remembered what he had just bring through. Then he heard a voice speaking out. Killed a mid-level, dark haze beast. 10 points acquired. Congratulations. You have activated the Institute's rankings list for this competition. In your position, you are 698th on the rankings. Please kill more beasts or mutated beasts to ensure you stay at your current position. His eyebrows rose upon hearing the words from his AI. 698th position? That is too low. Seems I need to go on a rampage. David muttered to himself. It was as if he had forgotten his previous predicament. His nose twitched. The aroma was tickling his nose, and his throat bubbled up and down as he gulped. It surprisingly smells good. He blinked his eyes, and he looked left and right. Without ceremony or any care, he totally dismantled the body of the beast. But he kept the poison sac and the needle thread to himself. It might come into good use. After he was done, he kept the sharp horn of the soaring thread serpent he had used in skinning the beast. The meat tasted quite delicious, but it was a bit difficult to chew on. He only had a slice of it, though, because the meat wasn't properly cooked, and he still didn't know if it was poisonous or not. But David could feel a slight warmth enter his body, and he felt quite refreshed. It was the same energy he always felt if he had breakfast in the morning inside the Institute, which seemed to imply that the Institute provides low-level dark haze beast as breakfast to its students. Such extravagance wasn't something an ordinary organization could provide. He couldn't help but admit at the might of the Institute. For every single student to have a low-level dark haze beast as breakfast, every single student, it would require an astronomical amount of gyno points. Checking his interface, still 2 uses left on. The life sign reader still had 2 uses left for today. The effect of the ability had faded a while ago. While its duration is incredibly little, it's still quite useful. David muttered to himself. He then turned his attention towards the thin vest that was still in the backpack. It was incredibly thin, almost as thin as cicada's wings, and was as light as feather. It was ashen color with 2 straps installed in it, which was used to tighten its reins on the shoulder. David didn't hesitate. He pulled off his shirt, revealing a muscular and streamlined body. His skin was pure and white as he hasn't been in the sun for a few weeks. A few weeks ago, he was thin and he could remember vividly complaining about it. But in just a few weeks of practicing the exercising manual and the food he had been given, he had buffed up quite a bit. He wore the thin vest on his naked body, but he realized that it was a bit bigger than he had expected. And as though it had heard his thoughts, the vest tightened around his body, making it very fit according to his body size. David sniffed in surprise. It was more convenient putting on a shirt. He opened his interface to check on the map of the location. He was about to execute his plan. David frowned with what he saw. The map had been deleted. Hazel, what is going on with the map? David interrogated, obviously puzzled. The map was only provided in order for the students to select their drop point. It had been programmed to be deleted as soon as you landed. The robotic voice of his AI responded back to him. The crease on his forehead increased. This situation had made his plan difficult to execute. He had only seen the map twice, and it wasn't enough to memorize the entire thing. But he had definitely imprinted the loot zone in his head. That was something he was never going to forget. The only problem was that he didn't know his current position, which made things slightly difficult for him. Breathing in deeply, he put on his shirt, his gaze determined. He remembered there were a few life form signs he had detected a few meters away from. Stomping his foot, he dashed away, and his figure faded within the forest. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at the safe zone, 3 groups stood in a triangular position at the gate to the safe zone. The situation was immensely tense as the temperature in his surroundings turned a few degrees colder. Lu Feng stood at the forefront of one group, his blue eyes in a glare, and what was surprising was that Sturm, Philida, and the 6 other students ranked in the rankings list were standing beside Lu Feng, glaring at the 2 groups of students standing opposite them. Standing in front of the second group was a female student with 5 other people behind her. She was as beautiful as a flower and as delicate as a silk. Her face was white and smooth with no pores to spot. No blemish could be seen either, and her green eyes seemed to shine together with her floating blonde hair and her succulent lips. But currently, her lips was curled up in a sneer as she gazed at the 2 groups in front of her. The third groups just consisted of 3 people, a male with the bearing of a gentle young master at the forefront and 2 beautiful women behind him that seemed to be his maids to him. While their numbers are little compared to the other 2 groups, the brainwaves they exuded almost rivaled that of the other 2 groups. The other students had moved away from the tense location as they didn't want to be caught in the crossfire between the 3 strong groups. Numerous other students stood far away on trees as they watched the unsettling situation. Suddenly, Philida broke the quite stared on as she said, "I will repeat myself. Who are you people?" Avian's sneer widened as she replied, "What does that matter? If you wish to battle, then let us fight. I want to see who will dare snatch the safe zone from my hands." The chill in her eyes increased. "I have never seen you in the Institute, and neither did any of you attended classes. Who exactly are you people?" Sturm growled loudly. If it weren't for the fact that Lu Feng hadn't initiated an attack yet, he would have long since attacked. The safe zone was a very important location to possess, as the area surrounding the safe zone had been cleared of any dangerous beast. Moreover, it contained numerous houses and foodstuffs with a few basic amenities to help the student pass through the days. And more importantly, it contained low-level gadgets that could increase the survival ability of the students and could also increase the combat ability of the students. Droxford smiled gently as he said, "Of course we are